Norėčiau su Inesa.
I will be talking in English. The translation is coming right now, I think. And for those who I was just advised to remind everyone that those who want to listen to the symposium, to the presenters in Lithuanian, one can do it either through the separate YouTube channel with the Lithuanian translation, simultaneous Lithuanian translation, or you need to push the interpretation button and then select the language that you want to listen to today. And yeah, a little bit short notice in Lithuanian. Tie, kurie norėtų klausyti simpoziumo lietuvių kalba, turėtumėte paspausti, Zoom'e esantys žmonės turėtų paspausti interpretation mygtuką ir ten pasirinkti lietuvių kalbą. Arba YouTube kanalą turėtumėte pasirinkti, kuris turi šią funkciją vertimo į lietuvių kalbą. Tai nuorodą į YouTube kanalą su lietuvių kalbos funkcija rasite DG puslapyje, jeigu kartais jis toks pasimetė. Ir dabar aš nuo šiol kalbėsiu angliškai, kaip ir visas toliau simpoziumas vyks anglų kalba. Now I'll switch back to English and want to again say hello to everyone. It's fantastic to have you here tonight. Me and Lucas will speak one by one because the two mics cannot work together. Welcome to the online symposium, Jonas Mekas and the New York Avant-Garde. My name is Inesa Brasiške, and together with Lukas Brasiškis, we are the organizers and moderators of today's event, as well as the curators of the major exhibition on Jonas' work, still present at the National Gallery of Art in Vilnius, Lithuania, until the 20th of February. The gallery is also a virtual host of today's event, and before I hand mic to Lucas, I would like to invite the gallery's chief curator, LOLITA JABLONSKIENŽ, to say a few welcoming words.
Hello, everybody, dear speakers, dear curators, everybody in the audience. Good afternoon here on this side of the ocean and good morning on the other side of the ocean, I believe. It is indeed a pleasure for me to welcome everybody in the name of the National Gallery of Art, a subdivision of the Lithuanian National Museum of Art, at this symposium. I believe our curators will explain later that it is part of a larger program that the National Gallery organizes in relation to the work and the versatile activities of Jonas Mekas and his centenary, the centenary of his birth, and also the Jewish Museum in New York is about to open an exhibition. And, you know, we will all celebrate that with the symposium speakers and participants. Just to give you a brief history about the National Gallery's involvement in curating and contributing to research of Jonas Mekas' work and also various contexts. We have started in 2005 when together with Liutauras Pšibilskis, I co-commissioned a Lithuanian pavilion at the Venice Biennale. And on the occasion, we published also a nice book, which is sold out. It was called, titled similarly as The Pavilion, Celebration of Small and Personal in the Times of Bigness. And the book accumulated a variety of conversations, letters, interviews with Jonas Mekas, which we thought was a very good start for presenting Jonas Mekas, both for the Lithuanian and international art community, not only film community, but art community. Later, we collaborated with Jonas in 2013, organizing his exhibition in Brussels at Beaux-Arts, or it was called Jonas Mekas and the Fluxus Wall. And on that occasion, we also published a book with some very nice contributions, researching his poetry, his film, also Jonas's relations to Fluxus movement, and various other things. We also organized an exhibition of Jonas Mekas' Fluxus collection, which was acquired from him by the Vilnius municipality. And in 2015, we organized an exhibition at the National Gallery and again published a first larger survey catalog of that collection. So I feel that the National Gallery of Art has always been with Jonas and has always been with his work and with curating his work and with researching his work. It is really a pleasure for me to also be part of this symposium where we can see new research into Jonas' work, into various contexts of, Jonas' work. So I hope that we will all be enriched from today's, speakers and discussions. And I wish the symposium a good spirit. An important thing, Inessa, it is very important.
Yes.
I forgot to give the thanks because we wouldn't have been able to organize that symposium without our sponsors, which is the Baltic American Freedom Foundation, the Lithuanian Culture Council, and the Ministry of Culture of Lithuanian Republic. And certainly my thanks go to the curators, to Inessa and to Lucas, and also to Giedrius Gulbinas, who has been assisting in organizing this event. Thank you. That's all.
Thank you, Lolita. You were speaking and I thought that we're still having our gadgets, getting those together. And I thought about Jonas, this famous phrase of his activities, like describing his institutions. He said that he's these institutions are disorganizedly organized, something like that. So me and Lucas, we are disorganizedly organized somehow. But do you want to say hello finally, Lucas?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Inessa, for introducing the symposium. And it's a great pleasure to be here with all of you, and specifically still part of the National Art Gallery, major event, exhibition, and all the side events, which was really a big experience, as well as adventure, as well as kind of lifetime encounter for us both, and just probably can repeat as well that the symposium and the title of it sort of also replicates the title of the Vilnius exhibition, Jonas Mekas and New York Avant-Garde. And the exhibition, as you probably many of you know, but some of you might still consider coming, so it will still be open for one more week if Vilnius is one of your destinations, or you live in Lithuania. You still have a chance to come and see the take we together with National Gallery we had on the question of Jonas' relation to New York Avant-Garde, of 50s, 60s, and 70s, and the exhibition covers pretty unusual, or so to say, not so often presented Mekas profile. We have his films there, and we have other avant-garde films. That was important for us. But the major question and idea for us was to really present Jonas' multifaceted activities in organizing New York Avant-Garde, by building institutions, by curating programs, by film programs, by publishing both journal Film Culture as well as a film column in Village Voice, and specifically how all of this worked together as some kind of creative, administrative, curatorial endeavor of his life. And of course, the legacy of that is still here and very important. Today we're sitting, and it's probably very nice to say, at Mekas Studio in New Jersey, in Mana Contemporary, run by Sebastian Mekas. And the studio will have another event today, the first event, the screening of Jonas Mekas portraits. And next week, as Inessa and Lolita mentioned, Jewish Museum is opening another major exhibition in New York. Jonas Mekas' camera was always running. So the opening, I think, is on the 18th of February. So we're like basically in this very intense time. And it's also not a surprise that there are so many dedicated Mekas dedicated events right now, because there's a for centennial celebration. Mekas would be 100 years old this year. So there are a lot of things coming. But that being said, in regard to this symposium, we were thinking about still discussing something we were thinking a lot in our curatorial endeavor, trying to basically reveal, touch upon different sides of Mekas activities, and we're super happy that great scholars and curators who are all having one way or another certain relation to Jonas joined us today. And we were like, it's Vanessa, a little thinking, you know, will everybody come and join and do it? And we're super happy that we have you all here. So without further ado, we will have, in terms of the structure, we'll have 4 presentations. So as I said, we're super happy to have here Johanna Gosse, Chrissie Iles, Ara Osterweil, and Jonathan Walley. And we'll present each of you separately before your presentations. But in terms of structure-wise, actually, we will have 4 presentations, and then we'll have some time for a discussion. And after all, we will open the floor for questions from the audience. And we invite everybody to write your questions to the chat, so even before the conversation ends. So we will have them ready, and we'll have happy to have a discussion after the presentations. So it's a nice beginning, I think, of a nice day here in New York. It's still pretty early morning. And I think from here, maybe I have not forgotten to say something important. Technically, I just want to remind you what Inessa said before. For non-English speakers, basically Lithuanians, you could choose Lithuanian subtitles on a Zoom window. So please do it if you feel you are more comfortable following us in this way. And I think here now we will just introduce the first presenter, Inessa, maybe.
Thanks. Yeah, just can you hear me well? Yeah, okay. Sorry, just double checking again. We're sitting around, there's this round table that Sebastian brought from Mekas' previous studio, and it has such a nice feeling to be sitting here where many discussions and studies happened before, but at the same time we're too close to each other at some point, and it creates some disturbances. But anyway, I believe we'll survive. Yeah, I just wanted to maybe mention just to add to what you've said, Lucas, that and Lolita as well, presenting the exhibition, but also, I mean, the symposium is the last sort of part of the four-part project. So the biggest one is the exhibition, the major exhibition of Jonas' work presented in Vilnius, Lithuania, but also together with the Jewish Museum, we co-published a major book, and I'm very happy to see among the attendees some of the authors of the beautiful essays that you can read in this book. Jonas Mekas, The Camera Was Always Running, published by Yale. And also, we had a film program at one of the art cinemas in Vilnius, just across the river from the museum, which was a really nice occasion to see original 16mm films screened in the theater. And today we have the last part, which is Symposium, which was conceived as a means to open up new portals of thinking on and through Jonas Mekas' multifaceted work. And we're super delighted to announce today's speakers, as Lucas just said, Ara Osterweil, Jonathan Walley, Chrissie Iles, and Johanna Gosse, who, to our great joy, agreed to take this journey together with us. So I'll just probably introduce the first speaker. Right now, our first speaker is Ara Osterweil, who is a writer, painter, and film scholar. She's also an associate professor of cultural studies in the English department, as well as the director of the World Cinemas program at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. Although, as she notes, originally she hails from New York City. Her first book, Le Cinema, The Corporeal Turn in American Avant-Garde Film, published by Manchester University Press in 2014, examines the representation of the body and queer friendships in experimental film of the 60s and 70s. It focuses on several filmmakers in Mekas' circle, including Barbara Rubin, Stan Brakhage, Andy Warhol, Ken Jacobs, Karel Schneemann, Yoko Ono, and Paul Scharitz. And I'm very, very happy to say that all of these artists are featured in the exhibition in Vilnius. Osterweil writes regularly for Art Forum and has published numerous essays in journals such as Art Journal, Camera Obscura, Film Quarterly, Border Crossing, a review of books, Little Joe, Framework, Brooklyn Rail, and Millennium Film Journal. She's currently teaching a full-length seminar on Jonas Mekas films at McGill University, and more of her work can be seen on her webpage, araosterweil.com. And I think I'll just pass the mic to Ara right now.
Good morning, everybody. I know it's not morning where everybody is. Two things I will apologize in advance for. One is that I've been saying Jonas Mekas for 25 years and old habits die hard. So I'll try to pronounce it more accurately, but I'm sure I will revert to that. And the other is that I have tried to cut this talk 20 times and it still goes a few minutes over. So please bear with me when we get to the end. You'll see why we need to. My talk is called From Wald to Walden. And this talk is dedicated to my friend P. Adam Sitney, who sacrificed a pair of shoes to the rain. You were born amidst the darkest days, but you have shed so much light. This is a talk about beginnings, about displaced origins, false starts, and dead ends, journeys that point one way, but end up swerving another, roads that seem to lead nowhere, only to open up into everything. It is a meditation on how someone with a camera or a mind like a camera might illuminate even the most dead-ended nowhere with a tiny aperture and capture what is. What follows is a palimpsest of fragments swerving like the rain, what Mekas would have surely called a note or a sketch. My goal is to suggest how the winds of time blew through the treetops in Jonas Mekas' films. Mekas often began with the rain, or interspersed it, or convinced his friends to run out and celebrate it even if it meant ruining a pair of good shoes. And I'm just going to share my PowerPoint with you. Proving difficult. Let me try again. Nope. There we go. Can you see? That's just for our Lithuanian speakers. It must have been the farm boy in him, this love of the rain, for it nourishes so much in his work. The seventh idyll from his book of poetry, The Idylls of Semenishkai, celebrates summer rain. Over from the Blue Ridge pines, across a low sky, blazing midsummer heat, thunder would close in, rumbling to tear the swollen cloud folds open, with rain to follow, in a nearing drone, hissing tough over the woods, fuming on field border elms and on the still uncovered crops of a hayrack out in the field. He ends the poem with only the kids now, splashing through the puddles, the swamp, the low-lying fields and grazing meadows, and wading the clayey overflow gullies to launch twigs and splinters. Now only the men, left stranded for shelter under an elm, stare after the rain, trailing its mist in the woods, and listen for the last of the thunder rumbling off. The Idylls of Semenishkai is a collection of pastoral poems that Mekas wrote while he was a displaced person in Germany, grieving his lost homeland in the winter of 1947-48. Lithuania was no more, but here he remembers the rain in his village with exquisite precision, how it drones, hisses, and fumes, splatters, spills, rouses, and gushes, drubs, slashes, fells, and lashes, bears down without a break in one steady downpour, and then trails off, leaving stranded men like Mekas to stare wistfully into the distance. Old is rain gushing down shrub stems, Mekas writes, and old is our talk of all this. Rain is different in New York City. Mekas must have marveled at that. There's no farmland to absorb it, no crops for it to nourish. Instead, it almost immediately pools and floods, turning the street into rivers. One second, sorry. Can you all see that? Okay. Can you, no. Something that happens when I try to make it full screen that doesn't work. So we'll play it like this. The psychic function of rain must have also changed for Mekas. After he arrived in New York in 1949, the rain could not help but recall. In New York, rain and snow became memorial to lost people and lost places, to childhood itself. Time, flooded with big, heavy drops, too ponderous for any ground or any medium to fully absorb. French Marxist philosopher Louis Althusser also begins with the rain, but only after he, like Mekas, had lost everything. It is raining, he writes, in the philosophy of the encounter. Let this book, therefore, be, before all else, a book about ordinary rain. Yet Althusser's essay is not, in fact, about ordinary rain. Our concern, he clarifies, will not be with that kind of rain, but another kind of rain, a profound theme which runs through the whole history of philosophy. Althusser is referring to the reign of Epicurus's atoms that fall parallel to each other in the void. Let me clarify that I am not an Epicurean, and my approach to philosophy is that of a gleaner, searching for morsels that might sustain me. I offer this simple explanation. The ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus thought that the basic constituents of the world were atoms, uncuttable, microscopic bits of matter flying through the void. For Epicurus, all the events that we could perceive could be explained as the collisions, reboundings, and entanglements of atoms. And although Epicurus did not think that there was a bottom to the universe, he nonetheless believes that atoms naturally fell downward at a uniform velocity like drops of rain, as the Roman poet Lucretius later put it. Occasionally, Epicurus believed that these atoms randomly swerved to the side. Without such swerves, there was no way to explain the collisions that were necessary for the formation of everything. Althusser seizes upon this concept of swerve to explain the philosophy of the encounter. His goal is to bring out the existence of an almost completely unknown materialist tradition, the materialism of the rain, the swerve, the encounter, the take. In other words, the contingency from which everything derives. Althusser underscores the audacity of Epicurus's thesis. No one knows where or when or how it occurs, but such an infinitesimal swerve induces an encounter with the atom next to it, and from encounter to encounter, a pileup and the birth of the world. Epicurus's notion that swerve, rather than reason or cause, is the origin of the world was a radical idea. It is a rejection of the a priori existence of reason or meaning, and an insistence that necessity is subordinate to contingency. Things happen not because they have been preordained or because they must, but because of a series of aleatory encounters. These encounters then crystallize, not in the way that things should be, but in the way that they are. Althusser locates an alignment of this idea in Heidegger's notion of the Es gibt, which can be translated from German to the there is, or this is what is given. I will soon return to Mekas, see there I did it, and his love of the rain. Before I do, I will read you one last quote from Althusser. There is world and matter. There are people. A philosophy of the Es gibt, of the this is what is given, opens up a prospect that restores a kind of transcendental contingency of the world into which we are thrown, and of the meaning of the world, which in turn points to the opening of being, beyond which there is nothing to seek or think. Thus, the world is a gift that we have been given, the fact of the fact that we have not chosen, and it opens up before us in the facticity of the contingency to a being in the world that commands all possible meaning. Althusser offers a theory of contingency. Mekas offers a poetics of it. Both were moved to do so out of loss and desperation, albeit of a mightily different sort. Mekas's journey might be regarded as a series of swerves. A poet who wrote against both the Nazi and Soviet occupation of Lithuania in the underground press, Mekas was compelled to flee his native country with his younger brother Adolfas in 1944. Armed with nothing but forged papers, they boarded a train heading to Vienna, where they hoped to attend university. In what Althusser might describe as a swerve, their train was joined to another carrying Russian and Polish prisoners, to a forced labor camp near Hamburg, where they too were imprisoned. After a failed attempt to escape to Denmark, they hid out on a farm where they remained until the end of the war. They spent the next 4 years in displaced persons camps. When they finally left for America in 1949, they were supposed to travel to Chicago, where they had found work at a bakery and had already secured an apartment. Transfixed by New York, they never made it. "This is the center of the world," the brothers Mekas said to each other as they peered at the New York.
Recording in progress.
"We are staying right here." Within a decade, Mekas had become one of the most important advocates for alternative cinema in the world. Within another decade, he had almost accidentally pioneered a film style made of single or clustered bursts of frames, often shot from the hip and rapidly edited together, that formalized the relation between memory and consciousness, poised on the threshold between the es-gibt and the consciousness of the filmmaker. Mekas's camera mediates the contingency of the world through his individual perception. Cognizant of the world as gift, Mekas's diaries, notes, and sketches are nonetheless as infused with the ecstasy of perception as they are with the pathos of loss. Lost, Lost, Lost is not only the name Mekas gave to the diary film that captures the first 14 years of his life in the US, but an acute description of the condition that we all share of being adrift in a world into which we are only temporarily thrown. Mekas's cinema is a poetics of the rain, the swerve, the encounter, the take. Mekas narrates the contingency of the world into which he was thrown in the opening of Lost, Lost, Lost. It's no surprise that his introduction ends with the rain. "Was there a war?" Mekas asks a few minutes later in an intertitle. Or was it only a swerve of the rain that carried him from Lithuania to Lorimer Street? For Mekas, life was an odyssey. His vocation was not to ask why, but to record the gift of the world as it was given, just the ordinary wonder of the encounter, how this light falls on this face in this crowd at this moment in this place. Es-gibt. There is no reason to ask if it is enough. It is more than enough. It is all there is. Mekas acknowledges as much in Lost, Lost, Lost. "Here I came," he says, "to this point, to this place. The winds have brought me here, and I see you, and I record you. I don't know if I ever understood you, if I ever really understood you, what you stood for, what you went to, but that was there. I was just a passerby from somewhere else, from completely somewhere else, seeing it all with my camera, and I recorded it. I recorded it all. I don't know why." He repeats this sentiment later in the film. "I don't know what blew me, what wins." Mekas's diary films document a series of provisional encounters that crystallize in the lens of the camera, but whose meanings only accrue belatedly at the editing table. Yet unlike still photography, which extracts the singular encounter from the flow of time, most films repress the viewer's recognition of the existential uniqueness of every moment through their consistent flow of images. Unlike most filmmakers, Mekas draws the singularity of contingency to the surface through his single frame, shop stutter, camera technique. His images fall not in a steady flow, but swerve unpredictably, like Epicurus's rain. And the pathos of his diary films is how they preserve the contingency of what was, while simultaneously reflecting on the loss of these encounters in voiceovers and intertitles that reflect upon how the passage of time changes what we see. I would like to begin this talk again by explaining my title, From Wald to Walden. And David, if you have not done so already, this is the part that Una has to be doing something else for. The phrase came to me as I wandered one day through an exhibit at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York in the autumn of 2019. Actually, wandered is not the right word. The exhibition focused on a series of paintings by Gerhard Richter called the Birkenau paintings. They stopped me in my tracks. They were inspired by 4 photographs that had been secretly taken in August 1944 by Jewish inmates forced to work in the crematoria of the Auschwitz-Birkenau concentration camp. The images are of Jewish prisoners bound for death. In one of these photographs, we see undressed women on their way to the gas chambers. In another, a blurry image of lifeless bodies being burned in an outdoor inferno. The camera and film had been smuggled into the camp by a Polish resistance group. It is now believed that a man named Alberto Herrera took the photographs with a camera that was aimed through the opening of the gas chamber where Zyklon B was poured. Herrera was a Greek partisan who fought the Nazi occupation of his homeland. He was arrested by the Germans, deported, and interned at Auschwitz, where he was assigned the position of Heizer, or stoker, in the crematorium. Herrera, who was hiding from the Nazi guards on patrol outside, was not able to aim his camera properly through the aperture of the crematoria. A single image of placid treetops and a series of otherwise horrifying images suggests that he was shooting from the hip and accidentally aimed too high. Immediately after taking the photographs, Herrera buried the camera in the soil for later retrieval. A Polish woman snuck the film out of the camp in a tube of toothpaste. They are the only known photographs to depict the process of mass murder in the gas chambers. Herrera took part in the Sonderkommando uprising. On August 9th, 1944, he tried to escape the camp during the transport of ash from the crematoria. After assaulting 2 Nazi guards with a shovel, he plunged into the Vistula River and tried to get away. He was captured and killed a few days later. The photographs were eventually used as evidence of the horrors of the death camps. German painter Gerhard Richter was 12 years old and a member of the Deutsche Jungvolk when Herrera took these photographs. In 2014, Richter used them as a point of departure for a series of large format black, red, white, and green abstract squeegee paintings. Although Richter is one of the world's most masterful painters, capable of exquisite hyperrealism, there is no recognizable imagery in these paintings, and I'd like to show them to you. Can you see, Ineza? Good, thank you. Dark smears of oil layered upon each other obliterate any trace of the photographs upon which they were based. Theodor Adorno famously wrote that to write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. Unlike the photographs, suffused by the light of a harsh, indifferent sun, there is not a trace of illumination in Richter's paintings. They are a cliché, I think, of how this brutality and barbarity might be envisioned, a blunt metaphor for horror and the unrepresentability. Yet we are still asking ourselves what roles art can possibly play in a world full of suffering, genocide, and now the threat of climate change. What does it mean to use images like this? Since the photographs first came to the world's attention, there has been much debate about whether and under what circumstances and to what end it might be morally justifiable to circulate them. In a culture glutted with images, what does it mean to consume images of atrocity? Out of respect for the dead, Richter abjured figurative imagery in this series and refuses to sell the paintings. Nonetheless, exhibiting museums often sneak the photographs in as a point of reference. That's how I remember seeing them, printed at a small scale, hung discreetly in the corner of the room. Except for a single image of treetops, I will not show them here. It is unthinkable that Herrera took such a photograph because he was startled by the beauty of the tree, as it appeared askance through his lens. Please be certain that my intention is not to aestheticize this image. It is rather to try to understand how it is, in its own way, as important as the others in the series. For despite the light that pours through these trees on this bright August day, this is an image of the darkest forest, of the Wald that haunts the very dream of civilization. It was then that I thought of Mekas. It was not only because this image looks as if it could have been taken from almost any avant-garde film of the 1960s, including and especially Mekas's own. It was because I wondered what Mekas's relation to the Wald might have been. Hang on a sec. When I use the German word Wald, I'm referring not only to the actual forests that surrounded Semenischkai, or the farm and camps of Mekas's wartime experience, but to the symbolic German forest of atrocity that Richter tries, and I think fails, to envision. How did Mekas ever swerve from that dark, uncannily sunlit place to the re-enchantment of nature and the world that we see in his films? If anyone ever asked me to write something about Mekas, I thought to myself in November 2019, as I stumbled with my eyes seared open in the museum, I must try to understand how he ever made it out of the Wald into his vision of Walden. For even when I do not fully understand my own instincts, my method as an artist and writer insists that I must follow them wherever they lead. Many scholars have discussed the way Mekas constructed a metaphor of paradise to counter the grittiness of actuality. But it is more than grittiness that Mekas encounters. Likewise, the paradise he constructs is more than a mere metaphor for salvation. It is salvation itself. As P. Adam Sidney writes, Walden is a name for home, and for what you see, it is a state of mind, an investment in the present moment, just as it is undergoing revaluation under the threat of destruction. It is my contention that the Walden, or utopia, that Mekas creates in his films both contains and displaces the Wald of terror that is glimpsed at a canted angle in the grave images smuggled out of Birkenau. In Mekas's practice, filmmaking became a way of re-enchanting a benighted world in which he found himself completely lost. It was his way of salvaging the bereaved I or self through the mediated perception of the camera eye. As Mekas says in Reel 1 of Walden, I live, therefore I make films. I make films, therefore I live. Light, movement, I make home movies, therefore I live. I live, therefore I make home movies. They tell me I should always be searching, but I'm only celebrating what I see. This is an existential recognition, which entails a nearly religious transformation. By filming, Mekas wrangled a method of surviving the memory of barbarity. Effectively, Walden is how he imagined the possibility for visual poetry after Versailles. Of course, Mekas was not in the inner circle of hell that Alberto Herrera's photographs document. Brutal as it may have been, one cannot compare Mekas's experience during the war or afterwards to the position of the Jews in the concentration camps. Yet Mekas does occasionally analogize his own displacement. In his diary from November 1946, he writes, "Now I am myself on a train with only what I can carry along, without possessions and without a country. I am a gypsy. I am the eternal Jew. I am a DP." Mekas begins Walden, a compilation of his diaries, notes, and sketches from the 60s, with what seems on the surface to be an equivalent image of treetops. That's not the image I want. Where is it? There. In English, there is an expression that someone can't see the forest for the trees. And it means that they cannot understand or appreciate the larger situation because they're so lost in the details. This is the opposite of how I understand Mekas's work. There's no doubt that he understood the forest. It is, however, possible that when Mekas arrived in New York, he was so attuned to the larger drama of wartime suffering and Lithuanian exile that he had to teach himself how to again see the trees. It wasn't that he didn't know how to appreciate detail. One of Mekas's greatest gifts is his keen attunement to the rhythms, textures, and vistas of everyday life, the rare drops of milk that whiten the soup, the grit of sawdust in the bread. It was that Mekas was searching for a way to record the details in a way that witnessed their material reality while simultaneously imprinting upon them his own subjective, idiosyncratic point of view. In his diaries, Mekas doesn't often name or describe the Wald as a place of horror. The few exceptions to this avoidant pattern are startling. Heed this entry from February 1948. Yesterday, I went to Wilhelmshohe, walked through the woods. I come very seldom here. I'm afraid to come here. It upsets me. I can't cope with it, with nature. It brings back too many memories. The slightest movement on the dark surface of the pond, the rotten, putrid black leaves on the bottom, the willow trees leaning and dipping their branches into the water, the steep banks. Everything is calling me back, wakening up the memories of Osterweil and Birzai. Birzai was a few kilometers from Mekas's village. On August 8th, 1941, 2,400 Lithuanian Jews were murdered there in the forest of Osterweil. No wonder Mekas avoided the forest and displaced the guns of the trees. In a diary entry from July 44, he declared himself unfit for the Wald. I am neither a soldier nor a partisan. I am neither physically nor mentally fit for such a life. I am a poet. Those who can put their hands on any weapon run into the woods, hide. Since I have no wish to live in the woods, and what's more, I have no knowledge of guns, my decision is to leave, and the further the better. By the time Mekas arrived in New York, the world must have been so disenchanted that he had to learn to see anew. Sidney quotes Mekas describing the centrality of a tree in the rediscovery of vision. There was a tree in Central Park that I wanted to film. I really liked that tree, and I kept filming at the very beginning when I began. And then I look on the viewer and it's not the same. It's just a tree standing there. It's boring. And then I began filming the tree in little fragments. I fragmented, I condensed. And then you can see the wind in it. Then you can see some energy in it. Then it became something else. Ah, that's more interesting. That's my tree. That's the tree I like. Not just a tree that's naturalistic and boring. Not what I saw in the tree when I was looking. I'm trying to get to why I'm looking at what I'm filming, why I'm filming it, and how I'm filming. The style reflects what I feel. I'm trying to understand myself, what I do. As Sidney has argued, this moment is both a symbolic and literal beginning of Mekas's unique cinematic vision. By fragmenting and condensing the tree, Mekas learns how to see it anew. It's no longer the tree solely as it exists in material reality, but as it is reimagined and virtually recarved in the shape of the poet's perception. It is through this fragmented cluster of details that Mekas discovers his own signature film style. By focusing askance on details of everyday life, he learns to re-enchant a world forever shadowed by the Wald. I'm not the first to point out that Mekas was an unlikely leader of the cinematic avant-garde. Yet I may be the first to insist that Mekas was, hands down, the most important American filmmaker of the post-war period. Rather than hiding his method of production, the staccato style of his diary films emphasizes the psychogeography that Mekas experienced in the space of possibility that was New York City in the post-war period. The belated intervention of his voiceover, added years and sometimes decades later, reflects upon those lost encounters and the feelings they held. Counterintuitively, his retrospective gaze makes space for future viewers, to envision a past whose possibilities and structures of feeling might be renewed in the present. The complex ways that these temporal modes collide in Mekas's films is what makes them such exquisite documents of being in time. In Sidney's extraordinary book, Eyes Upside Down, about the influence of Emerson on visionary filmmakers like Mekas, he isolates the experience of looking through a window askance as central to their poetics. The title of his book comes from Emerson's writing, Turn the Eyes Upside Down by looking at the landscape through your legs. And how agreeable is the picture, though you have seen it any time these 20 years. Sidney goes on to explain how the transformation of necessity into a category of poetics became central to visionary filmmaking. To do so, he quotes John Cage's 1949 lecture on nothing. I'm putting a slide up of it, not to expect you to read it, but so you can see how it's laid out on the page. Cage's lecture demonstrates the centrality of vehicular motion in the avant-garde's reimagining of vision. Cage asked listeners to regard his lecture as something seen momentarily, as though from a window while traveling. If across Kansas, then of course Kansas. Arizona is more interesting, almost too interesting, especially for a New Yorker who is being interested, in spite of himself, in everything. Or you may leave it forever and never return to it, for we possess nothing. Our poetry now is the realization that we possess nothing. We need not destroy the past, Cage writes, because it is gone at any moment. It might reappear and seem to be and be the present. Of course, not all the revelations afforded by looking askance through an unlikely aperture were agreeable. To shoot an image through the window of a moving car while road tripping across Kansas or Arizona can hardly be compared to shooting an image through the opening in the side of a crematoria, although they both may produce a candid and perfect image. The first is undertaken from an interest in the world whizzing by, despite one's world weariness. The latter is undertaken out of a desperate necessity to record a genocide that would otherwise remain invisible. The recurring image of trees in Mekas's films and in the Sonderkommando photographs are, I would argue, formally related, but only one hinged upon the ultimate risk of embodied vision. What they share is the inescapable centrality of the photographer's body in a particular locality and the way they archive how history intervenes in the photographic encounter between body and world. When the Sonderkommando images were first distributed by the Polish resistance, they were cropped and the black frames removed. The goal was to provide clearer, more streamlined evidence of what had occurred in the camps. The philosopher Georges Didi Huberman critiqued this presentation for its attempt to sanitize the image. The cropping unwittingly erases the act of resistance that is embedded in the image's mode of production and visible in its frame. Taking the photos through the aperture was an event that cost the photographer his life. As Huberman writes, that mass of black gives us the situation itself, the space of possibility, the condition of existence of the photographs themselves. I do not return to the specter of these grim images lightly. I return because I cannot help but trust my instinct that the image of the treetops accidentally captured in Alex Ibarra's photographs and the horrors they signify are an unexpected aperture through which we can understand Mekas's swerve from Wald to Walden and the role of the cinematic image more generally in the post-war avant-garde. Beneath experimental cinema's insistence on visualizing its own mode of production and Mekas's emphasis on the contingency and partiality of his own cinematic frame is the imperative to record the world as it is. Yet there is more at stake than the documentary impulse. There is, as Sidney describes, the insistence on the irreducible particularity of things. This particularity includes both the precarity of the filmmaker's body and the multiple frames through which he sees. Mekas's inclusion of visual evidence of the material conditions of his acts of filming are essential to their politics and aesthetics. Indeed, I would go so far as to say that in experimental cinema's trope of the canted, handheld frame, even of something as innocent and apolitical seeming as the trees or rain, we can trace the obscured history of the act of witnessing that is explicit in Alex Ibera's photographs of Birkenau. Mekas was interested above all in the history of amateur film and what it witnesses. In his anti-100 Years of Cinema manifesto, he declaims, "I want to speak for the small, invisible acts of human spirit, so subtle, so small that they die when brought out under the Klieg lights. I want to celebrate the small forms of cinema, the lyrical form, the poem, the watercolor, etude, sketch, portrait, arabesque, and bagatelle, and little 8mm songs. In the times when everybody wants to succeed and sell, I want to celebrate those who embrace social and daily failure to pursue the invisible, the personal things that bring no money and no bread." Mekas was looking for joy. He wanted to celebrate the invisible history of people's lives, hence his belief that real cinema happened between the frames. But he was also dedicated to recording the fleeting evidence of the encounter in the very moment of its disappearance. Each of us, in all these centuries of humanity, timeless atoms, reverberate into infinity, Mekas reflected. All of my work is celebration of reality. Everything is important. The Sonderkommando photos are the limit case of the folk culture that Mekas celebrated, but they are part of the same expansive history of amateur images to which he devoted his life. To make such images, in spite of it all, was a necessity, even when daily life turns into the stuff of nightmares. Mekas was interested in the moment when the invisible becomes visible. It becomes real only when people see it. One is a branch of humanity, he reflected toward the end of his life, a tiny little branch of humanity. Thank you.
Thank you, Ara. Thank you very much. Lucas, do you want to present our next speaker?
Thank you very much, Ara. Again, we'll have a time for the conversations and discussions after all the presentations. And now I just want to introduce the second speaker, Jonathan Walley, who will present a paper called "It Can Also Be Found in Nature, Jonas Mekas and the Blurring of Film, Art, and Life." And Jonathan Walley, we are so pleased to have him here, is an author of Cinema Expanded, Avant-Garde Film in the Age of Intermedia, published by Oxford University Press very recently. And his scholarship has appeared in October, Millennium Film Journal, Moving Image Review, and other publications. And he has a numerous collections of writing on avant-garde cinema, arts, and film. And he teaches in the Department of Cinema at Denison University. And please, I'm now just sharing the mic with Jonathan.
Thank you, Lucas. And thanks to you and Inessa for inviting me to this. Thanks also to Lolita and to Gadrius for their assistance in communication with all of us as we prepared for this event, and to the National Gallery of Art, of course. I knew I was going to be in trouble when I saw that I was following Ara in this symposium, because I'm going to be talking to a certain extent about poetry, I think visual poetry, but I'm not going to be able to do it in nearly as poetic and expressive language as Ara, but I've been in that situation before. So the title of my talk is "It Can Also Be Found in Nature, Jonas Mekas and the Blurring of Film, Art, and Life." And while I'm talking, I'm going to share my screen. And throughout my talk, I guess I will be on a tiny image on the sidebar, but I encourage everyone to look instead at the screen. It's much more interesting, at least hopefully. I'm going to begin with two statements by two men who loom very large in the history of cinema, but who may not be two figures that we usually think of in connection with one another, Jonas Mekas and Andre Bazin. Mekas in 1965 writes, "There is a paradox here. The cinema, even at its most ideal and abstract, remains in its essence concrete. It remains the art of motion and light and color. Once we leave our prejudices and preconditionings aside, we open ourselves to the concreteness of the pure visual and kinesthetic experience, to the realism of light and motion, to the pure experience of the eye, to the matter of cinema." Bazin writes, although we don't know exactly when, in the 1950s, not long before his death, "To define a film style, it is always necessary to come back to the dialectic between reality and abstraction, between the concrete and the ideal. There is no point in rendering something realistically unless it is to make it more meaningful in an abstract sense. In this paradox lies the progress of the movies." When Inessa and Lucas kindly invited me to take part in this symposium, they asked me to remark specifically upon Jonas's relationship to expanded cinema, which is a subject I've researched and written about for a while now. Expanded cinema refers to moving image works that claim new territory for the cinematic, beyond traditional moving image media like film and video, outside the conventional theatrical exhibition space, and often in the gaps or areas of overlap between cinema and the other arts. The term first appeared in the 1960s and has over time encompassed film and video installation, video and televisual art, light art, kinetic sculpture, holography, computer-generated imagery, cinematic performance, multi-screen films, laser light shows, the list goes on and on. I'll elaborate upon this definition of expanded cinema shortly, but first I want to note that I was daunted by the prospect of talking about Jonas and expanded cinema because Jonas didn't make expanded cinema himself. He worked predominantly in so-called single-channel format. That is, he made films intended for viewing on a single screen, one reel at a time, in a traditional exhibition space. Jonas was certainly a major supporter of expanded cinema, writing about it frequently in his movie journal column in the Village Voice, organizing exhibitions and festivals of expanded cinema, and proselytizing expanded cinema works and their makers. I'll make reference to all of this activity around expanded cinema, but I also want to consider the ways in which Jonas espoused a conception of cinema that was spiritually aligned with expanded cinema, even if he did not make such work. I will suggest here tentatively, this is things I'm still very much thinking through, that Jonas's cinematic aesthetic, as he articulated it in his writings and films, was an especially radical embodiment of a film historical dialectic that has played out since the silent era, and which was reanimated forcefully in the 1960s in both avant-garde film and the international art cinema. That dialectic is the one that Jonas and Andre Bazin spoke to in the twin epigraphs that began my talk, between a modernist aesthetic and a realist one. This interplay or exchange of these two opposed aesthetics was one of the most dynamic features of 1960s cinema, I think, evident as much in the classical arts and auteur cinema as in the emerging American underground film. Mekas radicalized and intensified this dialectic between modernist and realist cinema in his own work and his cinematic ethos, so to speak. In doing so, he paralleled some of expanded cinema's major aesthetic preoccupations. Before I continue, I want to take a moment to map out expanded cinema's territory, the better to see where Jonas stood in relation to it. The term expanded cinema first appeared around 1964 and has been attributed to several coiners, including Jonas himself. It is a spatial metaphor, implying that cinema is getting bigger, occupying more territory. This expansion took place in 3 dimensions. It's a technological expansion, beginning with a proliferation of electronic imaging and communications media in the 1960s. Video and television, projected light, holography, and emerging telecommunications media constituted an expanded field of moving image media, or expanded cinema. This expansion is also categorical, as the art of cinema, or the moving image, took on new forms, such as video art, moving image installation, computer animation, and kinetic sculpture. These were associated with specific technologies quite often, but not identical with them. For instance, video art like Shigeki Fukubota's Du Champiana, New Descending the Staircase, and alternative television such as Stan Van Der Beek's Violence Sonata used quite different variants of video, producing markedly different meanings and experiences and references. Cinema's expansion, finally, was also a literal one, from the illusory space of the 2-dimensional screen into real 3-dimensional space in the form of projection performances and installations. Expanded cinema was related to the so-called expanded arts. Both terms name a condition wherein new artistic media proliferated. Traditional art forms like painting and sculpture were reimagined or abandoned, and long-held assumptions about the very nature of art and its place in society were fundamentally challenged. Conceptual art, performance art, intermedia, and land art emerged from this moment, while expanded cinema served as an umbrella term for a constantly growing field of art forms utilizing moving image, projected light, screens, and immersive optical experiences like Tony Conrad's The Flicker. All of this expansion makes for a slippery and much debated category. If all of these things are cinema, and all of these forms were named in the 1960s by various authors as examples or variants of expanded cinema, if all of these things are cinema, then what isn't? What meaning can cinema possibly retain under these conditions? And what is the place of more traditional cinema in this new expanded landscape? These questions were particularly pressing for Jonas, who persistently grounded expanded cinema in the history of cinema as traditionally conceived. He was troubled by the implications of expanded cinema for what he called cinema as we know it, and the extent to which the two could be reconciled. A June 1964 movie journal entry began, "There are very strange things happening in cinema," and went on to provide a history of cinema beginning with the Lumières, running through 2 generations of avant-garde filmmakers, and into the most recent work in expanded cinema, drawing a line of historical continuity from cinema's origins to work that seemed quite distant from these. To lessen this distance, Jonas made the rhetorical move of positing cinema as an ancient art form, in existence long before the invention of the film medium, which was a strategy for refamiliarizing filmless forms of expanded cinema that employed only lights, shadows, vapors, hallucinations, and dreams. And I'll add that Bazin actually does something quite similar in his essay, The Myth of Total Cinema, that is to essentially see cinema as the oldest rather than the youngest art form. The most direct expressions of Jonas's ambivalence toward expanded cinema are found in his movie journal coverage of the New Cinema Festival in late 1965, sometimes alternatively referred to as the Expanded Cinema Festival. In an entry from November 11th, he wrote, Not all that's happening at the Film-Makers Cinematheque this month can be called cinema. The rest of the entry plumbs this question of what in the festival was cinema and what was not, and why. While enthusiastically proclaiming that expanded cinema artists like Nam June Paik and Agnes McClies dissolved the edges of this art called cinema into a frontiersland mystery, much of the rest of his entry takes up the work of reining this process back in. The cinema aspect dominates these works, he wrote, adding, so the avant-garde artists who are working in a more classical tradition of cinema are asking themselves what this new gush of light motion art will do to their work. Have no fear, cried the captain. No good old art is ever invalidated by the new art. With 5, 6, 7 years perspective, these far, far out anti-art works will begin to fall into the same 1,000-year-old treasury of all art. Jonas thereby solved the frontiersland mystery of expanded cinema's identity with historical perspective and the continuity of cinematic tradition. He thus brought to expanded cinema a film historical background that many other critics did not, seeing it in terms that we might call cinecentric, reading quite different values into it than those asserted by many of its practitioners. The quality Jonas most frequently wrote admiringly of in his accounts of expanded cinema was its immediacy, its status as living art, life work, performative, participatory, social in nature, and often in its site specificity and its liveness, ephemeral, fleeting. Much more important to Jonas than new technologies or aesthetic forms was the expansion of consciousness that these made possible, meaning the collective social consciousness of the community of man, to put it in Jonas's words at the time. While expanded cinema could be taken, especially by a critic seeking to reconcile it with traditional cinema, as a reflexive modernist meditation on cinema's unique materials and effects, what was actually more important to Jonas was its immediacy, liveness, and authenticity. While expanded cinema works might have called attention to cinema's materials, its projections, frames, screens, and so on, it was principally an exploration of a more essential materiality, the real time and space of cinematic exhibition and experience, which distinguished it most radically from conventional and commercial cinema's illusionism. When Jonas was critical of expanded cinema events, it was almost always on the basis that they exhibited showmanship or virtuosity, terms that for him were hallmarks of an inauthentic theatricality rather than a direct, immediate life experience. Recalling a performance by Usko as part of the show Psychedelic Explorations in July 1965, Mekas wrote the following. I liked the part which preceded the program proper. I mean, when the projectors and slide machines were being tested, lights arranged, flashes of unusually beautiful whites, fleeting glimpses of an imperfectly placed slide, the empty slide frame full of light. I remember liking a number of movies, both of Hollywood and underground breed, in their rushes, in their chance order, with the different takes growing into strange symphonies. But I saw little in them when they were completed. The non-art of rushes had more power in their chance state than artistically organized end results. Here, Jonas refers to a dialectical exchange between two different approaches to art. David James summarizes these perfectly in an essay on Jonas's diary films, which he tellingly calls Jonas's life work. James writes of a distinction between two avant-gardes, one that creates aesthetically autonomous works of art in which alienation is objectified, and one that assaults the autonomy of the aesthetic itself toward the end of returning art to the praxis of life. Clearly, Jonas favored the latter ambition of expanded cinema, and in this respect, he echoed Gene Youngblood, another early writer on the subject. Youngblood wrote, "When we say expanded cinema, we actually mean expanded consciousness. Expanded cinema does not mean computer films, video phosphors, atomic light, or spherical projections. Expanded cinema isn't a movie at all. Like life, it is a process of becoming. By this logic, art rejoins the real in the blurring of art and life, to use the artist Alan Caprow's phrase. The immediate, unrehearsed, chance-driven moments of an expanded cinema event, unassimilated into an autonomous aesthetic object detached from the real time and space of the viewer participant, is ultimately what Mekas most appreciated in expanded cinema, not because expanded cinema could uniquely offer such an experience, but because it was the same sort of experience on offer in the best underground cinema. The most cinematic expanded cinema was simply an extension of a defining value of avant-garde film in general, and in Mekas's films in particular. And I think that value can be summarized in the term realism. I'm going to talk over these images from Walden without the sound as I go on. Several critics have noted the centrality of realism in Jonas's writing and the slipperiness of that concept, particularly in his hands. John Pruitt relates Jonas's commitment to realism to the fact that he was essentially a European critic attempting to reconcile a long commitment to one tradition, exemplified by Italian neorealism, British free cinema, and the Nouvelle Vague, with his deepening commitment to another, embodied in direct cinema, beat films, and the films of Stan Brakhage or Marie Menken, among others. Jonas's own filmmaking begins in a more conventionally art cinema mode with Guns of the Trees and The Brig. These combine a modernist reflexivity with a radical version of documentary realism in the form of long takes and improvisatory handheld camera work, lending both films a documentary authenticity, a rawness that was the hallmark of the new American cinema. In this way, his early films parallel those of the French New Wave, especially Godard, who put Eisensteinian and Vertovian modernism into dialectical engagement with realism of a Bazinian or Renoirian bent. Ultimately, however, it is the latter, albeit in a decidedly avant-garde variant, that Jonas privileged. While his diary films might appear at first glance to be the apotheosis of cinematic modernism, in fact, they are animated by a realist ethos carried to its logical conclusions, in much the same way that expanded cinema, to Jonas's thinking, was built upon the foundations of cinema as we know it. To clarify this point, it is useful to compare Mekas's realism with Bazin's. Now, if the link between Jonas and Bazin seems strained, it is likely because the latter's realism is commonly explained in terms of specific approaches to filmmaking style in the work of the directors Bazin championed, which required technical mastery and substantial resources entirely alien to the avant-garde, in addition to a kind of film professionalism, quite in contrast to the amateur cinema that Mekas professed. The parallels between Jonas's cinematic realism and Bazin's comes into relief when we examine the ethics behind the aesthetics. In the interest of time, I'll just indicate some of these parallels notionally. First, a rejection of symbolism or other forms of imposed meaning in favor of the unimposed upon object in its natural surroundings, its innate integrity, its status as fact respected. Comparing Pull My Daisy favorably to ensemble films by an earlier generation of avant-gardists, Mekas wrote, "We know that Richter and Cocteau have used friends, painters, and poets in their films. However, they have used them in symbolic situations. Pull My Daisy has nothing to do with any such literary symbols. The situations are everyday situations with no other intentions." End quote. This evinces a refusal to abstract objects from their place in the world. Though the film diaries are filled with close-ups of specific objects, they do not pull these objects. That is, they do not take the step that turns fact into symbol of something else. R. Bruce Elder explains this facet of Jonas's filmmaking quite nicely. He writes, "The principal trope Mekas employs is synecdoche, and synecdoche paradoxically relates his shot fragments to the world from which they derive, inasmuch as it implies its continuity with that world. At the same time, the trope transforms these fragments by assimilating them to a new relational context, a context in which their meanings are wholly intrinsic." Now, similarly, Bazin argued that realist cinema, quote, turned its back on metaphor and symbol in favor of objective presentation. What he called the regeneration of realism in the sound era made cinema, quote, capable once more of bringing together real time in which things exist, along with the duration of the action, for which classical editing had insidiously substituted mental and abstract time. Bazin's appreciation of Renoir's films, for example, was rooted in the way they were built not around, quote, situations and dramatic developments, but around being, things, and fact, unquote. A second parallel, a filmmaking procedure that, in James's words, preserves the optical phenomenology of shooting. Perception is circumscribed by what may be seen through the camera, while whatever is not immanent in it and mediated through it never appears. This is one way we might explain what I'll simply call the off-framing, typical of the lyrical, poetic avant-garde cinema, of its refusal to utilize conventional, pleasing compositional tropes, which, in modernist fashion, organize the content of the shot according to the structure of the film frame, hiving that content off from the integral reality from which it was plucked. Similarly, and in one of the most breathtaking passages in all of Bazin, we find this anti-modernist definition of the film screen and frame. Plastically, the screen is most often made to conform to the limits of a canvas, and dramatically it is modeled after the stage. With these two traditional references in mind, directors tend to conceive their images as boxed within a rectangle, as do the painter and stage director. Renoir, on the other hand, understands that the screen is not a simple rectangle, but rather the homothetic surface of the viewfinder of his camera. It is the very opposite of a frame. The screen is a mask whose function is no less to hide reality than to reveal it. Finally, I see a parallel between Jonas and Bazin in a shared belief that meaning, poetry, and truth are immanent in the world, in its natural objects, or again, in being, things, and fact. For Bazin, realist directors searching for resources beyond the abstractions of montage uncovered the secret of a film form that would permit everything to be said without chopping the world up into little fragments, that would reveal the hidden meanings in people and things without disturbing the unity natural to them. Now, to be sure, Jonas's diary films are rapidly edited, but they by no means chop the world up into little fragments, to use Bazin's phrase. There is no sign of the symbolism of montage or the illusionism of classical continuity editing. The fragmentary quality of the diary films is an index of the real circumstances of their making, the reality of Jonas's life. Furthermore, all those bursts of imagery, those vibrating pixelated visions, cohere like the impressions in what Elder has called Jonas's paratactic poetic form, which, quote, presents fragmentary perceptions of reality in what seems an almost random accumulation. The work discovers, as its form evolves, a pattern that holds these fragments together. The tendency to create forms that unify fragmentary impressions, that evolve order out of seeming disorder, is a constant in Mekas's work. which exhibits a tendency to discover immanent meaning in that which seems to lack meaning. Now, the title of my talk derives from a brief statement that Jonas gave at a roundtable discussion on the nature of cinema that was hosted by Chrissie Iles in relation to the Whitney's Magisterial Dreamlands exhibition. Jonas had dutifully printed this statement out on half sheets of paper and gave one to each participant, and it's now taped to my office door. It read, "Cinema, with a C lowercase, is the visual result made manifest with the tools and technology of making moving images. It can also be found in nature. The accumulation of products of that human activity we call cinema with capital C, as in writing and writing." Jonas's word for that natural meaning discovered in the world by the filmmaker with his little camera stilo, the Bolex, was poetry. And given that poetry and cinema were essentially synonymous for him, we can say that Jonas found cinema in the world as though it were, like him, a force of nature. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. It's again really inspiring presentation, which already brings so much thoughts, and I'm really already waiting for a discussion. And just a reminder, if the attendees have some questions, please just type them to the chat, and we will respond later. And now I will present the third speaker we are very happy to have in the panel, Chrissie Iles. Chrissie will read a paper called Light to Light, Jonas Mekas and the artist community around 80 Wooster Street. We're again already excited about that because 80 Wooster Street plays pretty important role in our exhibition as well. And we are pleased that Chrissie joined us. For some of you, probably everybody already know, but Chrissie Iles is the Anne and Joel Grand curator at the Whitney Museum of American Art. And her curatorial focus is the cross-disciplinary role of a moving image in the history of American art and its radical possibilities for shaping new global futures. And her exhibitions include several large thematic exhibitions of time-based media. She has co-curated the 2004 and 2006 Whitney Biennales and working on the upcoming exhibition Mountain/Time. We're very happy to have Chrissie here, and I'm just welcoming her and sharing the screen.
Thank you very much, Lucas, and thank you, Inessa, and also Lolita for inviting me to participate in this symposium. I'm honored to be here with Ara and Jonathan and Johanna. Thank you also, Gedrius and the technical team. I'll try not to speak too fast, and it's wonderful to hear you speak Lithuanian, and I hope it'll be easy to translate. I'd also like to thank Sebastian Mekas, who is just an ongoing wonderful support and inspiration, and it's just been so important for my understanding of Jonas's work. I would try to pronounce it correctly, it's hard. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to talk to you today about the period from 1968 to the late 1970s, when Jonas ran the New York Cinematheque at 80 Wooster Street in Soho, which was the first Flux House cooperative established by George Maciunas. And Jonas and the Cinematheque became key elements of an artistic community that emerged in downtown New York City in the late 60s. And it became a space for a cross-disciplinary experimentation and dialogue that created a kind of portal for artists to explore new forms of time-based work in performance, dance, poetry, theatre, and film, all within this expansive framework of cinema. And so I'm going to look at Jonas's role as a catalyst, connecting everyone together, and his dispersal of the cinematic into a kind of collaborative, rhizomatic praxis, provisional, dialogical, and then a constant state of transformation. And I'd argue that Jonas's ability to operate in this rhizomatic way is, as Ara has so precisely and eloquently argued, because he was a poet first, and that his engagement with a cinema that was provisional and that must continuously be transformed in order to stay alive is rooted in the creation of non-cinematographic cinematic forms by artists, writers, and poets across Europe and Russia from the 1920s to the 1950s as a resistance to the, quote, emerging condition of universal mediation brought on by the cultural ubiquity of cinema, as Pavle Levi observes. And as Levi argues, the opposition to the recalibration of the imaginary as technological involved separating cinema from its materiality and allowing it to function as other forms. In the early 1950s, letrist artist and poet Isidore Isu, seen here, treated the medium of cinema, as Levi observes, to the logic of general convertibility. And he inaugurated a series of purely conceptual shifts with which he granted each of the existing mediums the right to function as another. This release of the imaginary from the shackles of technological determination echoed the experiments of numerous writers and artists in the 20s for whom writing was understood as a form of cinematic praxis. In 1923 in Belgrade, for example, the Serbian poet Monida Bulli wrote a text, Dr. Hypnoson, or The Technique of Living, sounds very Jack Smith, which he described as a paper movie or written cinema, occupying a space somewhere between literature and cinema. He explored the hallucinatory possibilities of this hybrid form. Thus, Hypnoson, he said, walks down a steep alley where the houses are not taller than people and made of non-transparent glass. The cosmic sages begin to bombard this glass city with rays of light. A black upright rectangle appears, full of darkness, akin to the secret entrances to the caves in which blind creatures reside in an eternal night. The Bulli is generating a kind of image production through poetry. His non-cinematic cinema is striking in its description of projected light breaking apart architectural space. A more concrete architectural rupture occurred in Vilnius in 1923 in the presentation of the New Art exhibition, a mixture of Lithuanian, Polish, and Russian avant-garde artists at Corso Cinema, demonstrating the fluidity of an avant-garde not yet fixed by spatial determinacy. Jonas, coming to New York from war-torn Europe and displaced from a Lithuania that had been occupied by Poland, Russia, Germany, and then Russia again, brought this intertwined poetic, literary, cinematic sensibility, shaped by layers of occupation and displacement, to a city of immigrants processing the collective trauma of World War II and regerminating the seeds of that early avant-garde thinking in a society which by the mid-1960s was roiled by racial inequity and violence, political instability, the beginning of the Vietnam War, the assassination of Kennedy and Martin Luther King, here are the Harlem riots following King's assassination, financial disaster, and general urban blight. Jonas moved through New York City with the same instinct for survival and itineracy of place that he'd experienced in Europe. During this period, the cinemas in the city were in a state of flux. Some were closing, others were opening, and Times Square, as you can see here, was becoming the center of a seedy district of movie houses. Jonas moved amongst them all, from cinema to cinema, remapping the parameters of cinema in a sort of cumulative way as an act of asking, as he wrote, where I am and what I am. I learned my geography from war maps, he said. So this kind of remapping through the cinema is very resonant there. One of the key early events he curated was in November and December 1965, when he presented a series of 30 multimedia, expanded cinema events, although he didn't call it that at the time, by artists including Robert Rauschenberg, Robert Whitman, Stan Vanderbeek, Pike, Jack Smith, Klaus Oldenburg, Warhol, and many others. Some of them took place first in the Astor Playhouse in 434 Lafayette Street, and then at this Wurlitzer showroom at 125 West 41st Street in the middle of Times Square. And as you can see, this is not a cinema per se. Klaus Oldenburg was the first presentation at 41st Street, and he said of this space, the 41st Street Cinematheque was a very special auditorium. This is the room in the Wurlitzer building where the Wurlitzers used to promote the sales of their violins and things by giving recitals. That's why its walls are all done up with pillars along the side. In Oldenburg's movie house performance, the audience were guided into the space and to the aisles, where they had to remain throughout the event, while 8 performers occupied all the seats and used them as a stage. The audience was encouraged to interfere with the light beam of the projector, which was showing no film. As Nadia Rotner argues, the frontality of cinematic experience was broken apart. Theatrical immersion replaced cinematic absorption, unquote. Oldenburg presented his viewers with an alternative cinematic form, cinema as a sculpture in light, time, and space, using actions and materials. In the previous year, Jonas had shot the 8-hour film Empire for Andy Warhol, filming the Empire State Building floodlit at night. It was being lit for the first time that April to celebrate the opening of the World's Fair, and at that time it was the only building in New York lit up at night. The 8-hour film premiered on March the 6th, 1965, at the City Hall Cinema in 117 Nassau Street in Lower Manhattan, another temporary site of the Cinematheque, and there it is. The radicality of Jonas's action, persuading the cinema to allow an 8-hour screening in a 575-seat film theatre, accepting that 95% of the audience would leave after half an hour at most, and that boredom, frustration, and disappointment would likely be the predominant responses, underlines Jonas's commitment not only to artists, but to the non-cinematic cinema that he would be the key figure in nurturing. It's significant that the film has rarely been shown this way since, and it's usually severely compromised by being shown in parts, 1 reel, 2 reels, or as a projection in a gallery space, God forbid, erasing its non-cinematic cinema context and thus its meaning. Go back to Worcester Street, the first image I showed you. The itineracy of Jonas's peripatetic cinematheque not only reflected the displacement he'd experienced in Europe, it also indicated the general instability of New York City during this period, as old spaces became abandoned and a shortage of habitable buildings to live and work, especially downtown, produced a housing crisis. Jonas's fellow Lithuanian emigré, Fluxus artist and friend George Maciunas discovered the empty, abandoned industrial spaces of what's now called Soho in downtown New York, but was then called Hell's 100 Acres. And inspired by the organizing principles of Lithuanian agricultural cooperatives, he created what he designated as flux houses to live and work. He established the first flux house cooperative at 80 Worcester Street in 1967, and Jonas took over the ground floor as a home for the Cinematheque, installing plumbing, wiring, and flooring. The district was zoned as industrial, so none of this was legal. It's hard to underestimate or describe, although I wasn't there at the time, but from reading and listening, the rawness of the flux house spaces, no bathrooms, electricity mostly illegally wired by Maciunas, no certificates of occupancy, or the roughness of the barely lit area where people were afraid to venture at night. As artists occupied building after building, a community quickly emerged. Theatre dramatists, writers, filmmakers, dancers, artists including Joan Jonas, Trisha Brown, Philip Glass, Robert Morris, Yvonne Rayner, Ornette Coleman, Hollis Frampton, Michael Heiser, Jackson McClough, Lucinda Childs, Simone Forti, Shigeko Kubota, Namjoon Pike. The list goes on, it's extraordinary. Robert Fiore, Robert Whitman, Mary Beth Edelson, Richard Foreman, Alison Knowles, and Abby Hoffman. The precarity of this new community, generated through Maciunas' initiative, evokes the unauthorized ad hoc Laubenkolonien that grew up in German cities during the Weimar period. In Berlin, they legally housed 35,000 demobbed soldiers and the poor during the financial crisis of the 1920s, in temporary huts and homemade structures, a hiding place for Jews, political radicals, and members of the resistance during the Second World War, and, as Florian Urban points out, ad hoc accommodation for many who lost their homes during the bombings, This, quote, informal architecture produced, quote, the ambivalent figure of the allotment dweller who was construed as a potential threat to the well-ordered social environment. This perceived potential threat to the social order is echoed in Jonas's cinematic remapping in New York City, in events such as his arrest and jailing overnight, along with others, for screening Jack Smith's film Flaming Creatures, seen here, a still film here, in the Bowery Theatre in St. Mark's Place in 1964. A reminder of the paranoia and hypocrisy that infused the increasingly chaotic environment of New York City during this period. Jonas wrote in 1960, just as this was all beginning, quote, "This generation is by a dialectical necessity a generation of irresponsibility and disobedience. It was precisely," unquote, "it was precisely in the housing of ambivalent figures, artists, by the informal architecture of flux houses in Hell's 100 Acres, that so much of what came to be known internationally as one of the most important creative periods in the history of American art emerged." In the earlier historical moment of Weimar Germany, the Laubenkolonien, and also Schrebergarten, operated alongside photography as an indication of what George Baker describes as, quote, "a loss of a unitary sense of social space, producing a multiplication of unanchorable sites." It could be argued that the itineracy of Jonas's Cinematheque, 6 cinemas before it settled temporarily in 80 Worcester Street, only to be on the move again 6 months later, was both a trace of that earlier European condition and a translation of it from the photographic to the cinematographic form, in which the Cinematheque operated as an unanchorable site, picking up where de Broglie, Artaud, Issou et al. Had left off. A fluidity of place and movement appeared on the site of 80 Worcester Street in the work of the dancer Trisha Brown, who was one of the first artists to occupy 80 Worcester on the floor above Jonas's Cinematheque. It was there that she created her most spatially ambitious work. We could see a picture of it by Babette Mangold here, Ruth Piece, in 1971, in which dancers on several buildings across Soho, including 80 Worcester, each performed a series of movements in which the next dancer repeated, so that the movements passed from one rooftop to another in an improvised composition, a kind of semaphore that emphasized transmission, or an almost cybernetic tracing of connections back and forth across the community's architectural sites as a form of placemaking that really sort of echoes Jonas's cinematic mapping. Trisha Brown's inscribing of her work onto the physical exterior of 80 Worcester Street and connecting that building to the others mirrored the interconnectedness of everything going on inside 80 Worcester at the Cinematheque, from screening films such as Paul Sharrett's piece Mandala End War here, to Flux films and performances. Machunas and Fluxus was a very sort of key, obviously, 80 Worcester was very rooted in Fluxus. Machunas and Jonas began to create an anthology of Flux films. And you can see it here. And it's the first sign of an archival impulse that was to eventually transform the Cinematheque into Anthology Film Archives. But 80 Worcester Street was operating without a license. And with a list of Department of Building requirements still pending, it was shut down in 1968. It says here, all our screenings of avant-garde film till now have been illegal. We've been told to close and legalize ourselves. We'll keep you informed about our progress in becoming legal. So the Cinematheque became peripatetic again, and then landed in 1970 at the Public Theatre, established by Lithuanian theatre producer and director Joseph Papp. In yet another elision between one art form and another, in one of the theatre's 5 spaces, Jonas built the Invisible Cinema, designed by Austrian filmmaker Peter Kubelka, who had been in dialogue with architects Johannes Spalt and Friedrich Courant in Vienna about creating such a space in 1958. The Invisible Cinema was a pitch black space with black velvet walls, ceiling and floor, black great seating for 90 people, each seat cut off from the next by hood-like blinders to make communication with and distraction from the person left and right impossible. The exaggerated immersive viewing conditions, which Kubelka called a movie viewing machine, and the bright screen produced an almost hallucinatory sensation. Yet despite the modernist rigidity of its insistent frontal, silent, dematerialized viewing, yet again, Jonas's collaborative invitation had transformed the cinema space into a site of experimentation. In 1974, the Cinematheque reopened back at 80 Worcester Street and was renamed Anthology Film Archives. Jonas invited video and fluxus artist Shigego Kubota, a close friend of Machunas, to create video programs and artist talks as part of an overall programming which was responding to the shifting moment in a diametrically opposite approach to the pure, in inverted commas, cinema shown in invisible cinema. This is a detail from a poster for a Video Freaks event, activist collective, video collective, in the 80 Worcester Street storefront window, with 525 videotapes, you can see them listed here, running every day for a month from 1 p.m. to 2 a.m. As well as the continuing inflection of 80 Worcester Street with a Fluxus philosophy, and here we have Manju Pike in a Fluxus performance. You can see various people in the audience from René Bloch to Joan Jonas and Jonas himself. It was also infused, 80 Worcester, with an Artodian theatrical street. Here's Richard Foreman's play Sophia equals Wisdom, Part 3, The Cliffs, in January the 26th, 1973. The young theatre director, Richard Foreman, had been involved with Jonas for some time, first organizing with him and for him the expanded cinema events of 1965, and then helping Jonas kit out the 80 Worcester Street space as a cinema. And Jonas asked Foreman to coordinate all the non-film events at the Cinematheque, stroke Anthology Film Archives. So Foreman booked performances, dance, experimental music, and also produced 4 of his own ontological hysteric theatre plays there in 1968 when the Cinematheque had to close down. Amongst the performances, readings, talks, and videos, a robust film program continued, to which artists from all over Soho, Tribeca, the East Village, Lower East Side, and beyond came. Just as he'd given so many other artists opportunities to show their work and show it in these different spaces, Jonas asked the artist Joseph Cornell, who had shown his collage film Rose Hobart in 1936 at the Julian Levy Gallery in New York during MoMA's Surrealism show, only to be shouted at by Salvador Dali, the eponymous story of Dali, who's in the audience, protesting that he had had that idea and Cornell had stolen it from his imagination. So traumatized was he by this outburst that Cornell refused to show the film again until Jonas talked with him and persuaded him to screen it at the Cinematheque. So that gap of 30 odd years, Jonas brought this film back into the world. He also worked with Cornell to produce a print from the original black and white print that is projected through a blue glass, and Cornell chose pink and made a second version. Kenneth Anger's Puce Moment from 1949, up here just to make the point that from the beginning, artists like Joan Jonas and Richard Serra frequently attended 80 Worcester screenings, and Jonas and Joan Jonas and Serra both described seeing Puce Moment there and being directly inspired to make their collaborative 1971 film Veil. This is a still from it here. Joan Jonas was also very influenced by Jack Smith. Here is a still from Jack Smith's No President from 1967. And Joan Jonas watched all Jack Smith's films that were screened at 80 Worcester, and her performance, Organic Honey's Visual Telepathy from 1972, was directly influenced. As she says, to quote, "For the character Organic Honey, I was exploring an erotic persona through costume, gesture, and mask. I had gone to see Jack Smith films and they greatly affected me. He was so different from everything else that was going on at the time. He was much more Baroque, and that gave me inspiration. I wanted to break away from what was going on then in dance and performance. It was an anti-literary stance. People didn't want to deal with literature, but from the very beginning, literature was important to me." This challenge in Joan's work to heteronormative models of the erotic and to the white male anti-literary norms of 1970s postmodernism locates Joan's work at the center of current debates, and its roots lie squarely in the film programming of Anthology at 80 Worcester. Joan also performed a performance specifically designed for the Cinematheque screening room at 80 Worcester, and performed in front of a film projected onto the screen behind her with pre-recorded video playing on a monitor turned on its side. Steve Reich and Philip Glass performed Philip Glass's In Again, Out Again at 80 Worcester on the 19th of May, 1968, with musical scores pinned around the room and the musicians moving around to play them. Jonas's openness to presenting works like this as a cinema that also contains the non-cinematic inspired artists, as we can see, to respond to the space and produce new kinds of non-cinematic forms. And this, in turn, reframed the films that Jonas screened there. The exceptional vision of this cultural Möbius strip at 80 Worcester resonated everywhere. Here is Trisha Brown's Man Walking Down the Side of the Building, for example, from 1970, in which Trisha Brown's partner, Joseph Schlichter, walked down the side of 80 Worcester, where they both lived, above the Cinematheque, and it was the inspiration for her iconic Walking on the Wall dance performance at the Whitney Museum a couple of years later in 1973. I also want to just mention the broader context for 80 Worcester and the other spaces that emerged around Anthology in the late 60s. For example, Ornette Coleman, 2 blocks away, moved into another flux house at 131 Prince Street in 1968, buying shares in the cult for 2 floors. He remained there for 6 years, and his loft, which he named Artist House, became the site of concerts, rehearsals, and various musical events with fellow musicians and friends, including Don Cherry, Ed Blackwell, and Charlie Hayden. It was also Ornette's living space. And he collaborated with experimental electronic composer Emmanuel Gent, who lived on the 5th floor. The Kitchen, founded in 1971 by video artist Steinman Woody Vasulka to show video, moved to Soho in 1973 on the same street as 80 Worcester. Artist Space, its first location was 155 Worcester, above Paula Cooper Gallery, a poetry reading by Jennifer Bartlett you can see here in 1974. Donald Judd bought 101 Spring Street in 1968 as a live workspace. Paula Cooper Gallery at 155 Worcester was the first gallery to come to Soho. There's the space inside. The René Bloch Gallery on West Broadway was where Joseph Beuys famously spent 3 days in 1974, locked in the gallery with a coyote, arriving and leaving in an ambulance so as not to touch American soil in protest of America's war in Vietnam and general policies. Gordon Matter Clark, Tina Gerard, and Cara Godin's restaurant Food on Prince Street is where artists ate, washed up, cooked, worked, and were invited as guest chefs. And maybe most significantly, Costelli Gallery. When Leo Costelli moved his gallery downtown to West Broadway, his first show was film. You can see the films projected onto the walls. And he included also films by Yvonne Rainer, Paul Sharits, Michael Snow, and other filmmakers that Jonas showed at 80 Worcester in his film and video distribution project, Costelli Sonneberg Tapes and Films. And he made this project in response to the number of artists who had started to make films. Whilst Anthology was not the only inspiration for artists to start making films, there are very few artists in either Soho or Costelli's gallery or his film distribution list who did not go to Anthology's screenings. The overarching frame of 80 Worcester as both a cinema and non-cinema, with its roots in this European non-cinematographic cinematic forms, as well as the film's ability to mobilize, as Christian Metz argued, such a large number of the axis perception connected these experiments with a moving image between artists in a way that sort of extended this own sort of Jonas's own kind of fragmentary filmic practice. Whoops, sorry. Jonas's showing of films by older filmmakers, such as Stan Brakhage and Kenneth Anger, exposed young artists and filmmakers to their work. But he also felt an increasingly urgent need to create an archive of these and other works, a historical record. He was in his 50s during the mid-70s, twice the age of almost all the artists around him. And he understood the importance of preserving a history that by its nature, as well as by its marginal status, marginal in inverted commas, was ephemeral and could easily disappear. This is what Aria so beautifully described as the contingency of what was. The importance of continuing this history is evident not only through the archives at Anthology on 2nd Avenue and 2nd Street, but also the continuing impact of Jonas and the filmmakers he showed, supported, gathered together, preserved, protected, and wrote about in his prolific writings on film with artists such as Los Ingravidos. And this is really, I think, important. The anonymous Mexican film collective, Los Ingravidos, which was founded in 2012 to quote, dismantle the commercial and corporate audiovisual grammar and its embodied ideology, is really important in terms of the continuing legacy of Jonas and his work. In collaboration with the film curator Almudena Escobar Lopez, they created this online Ancestrilidad y Trance. This is a screenshot of what they describe as a constellation of films and texts mapped within the pictographic organization of the Aztec sunstone. The sacrificial stone is carved with the Aztec solar calendar, but connected with the monolith, I'm going to pronounce this really badly, Coyotzalqui, moon, and the figure of Coatlicue, earth. We are using these cyclical references to the Aztec calendar to link the violent relational chants of our presence. Violent why, I'll tell you in a second. The project includes over 40 films by the collective, as well as Stan Brakhage, Beatrix Santiago Munoz, Teo Hernandez, Jose Valdeomar, and Santiago Alvarez, combined with spells, poems, calligrams, manifestos, and textual fragments written in Nahatui, Spanish, English, and Portuguese by a number of writers and filmmakers, including Maya Deren, extracts from New American Cinema, Ziga Vertov, Skyha Pinker, Glaba Rocha, and Jean Rouge. Jesse Lerner, who curated a Latin American program at the Brakhage Center in 2020, just as the pandemic was hitting, described the displacements and exiles that lie at the center of the collective's work, and in new Latin American experimental moving images in general, and the importance of the dialogue with experimental film as a form of resistance. This film from the collective is from the Sun Quartet and addresses the protests in Mexico after the disappearance of 43 students after an attack by the police in 2014. The perpetual displacement that runs through Jonas's work as a generative energy reappears here in the collective's work in this kind of dialogue where films and texts from Latin America and from the American avant-garde are brought together in ways that, to quote them, understand filmmaking as a form of ritual that opens spaces of acute awareness and deep listening, end quote. There is a sense, to me, of both renewal and continuity in this new echo of Jonas's vision that I find profoundly moving. So that's the end of my talk.
Thank you, Chrissie. Thank you very much for such a rich talk. And I'm already waiting for the discussion and Q&A. But before that, let me introduce our last speaker, Johanna Gosse. Johanna is an assistant professor of art history and visual culture at the University of Idaho. She co-edited, together with Timothy Scott, Nervous Systems, Art Systems and Politics since the 1960s, published by just published by Duke University Press. Her writing is published or forthcoming in Journal of Cinema and Media Studies, Camera Obscura, Millennium Film Journal, Art Journal, Oxford Art Journal, and Radical History Review, in exhibition catalogs as well, such as Ray Johnson, CEO, by Art Institute of Chicago, Yale University Press in 2021, and Bruce Connor, It's All True, published by San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, University of California Press in 2016. Her writing is also featured in numerous edited collections. In 2015, she received an Arts Writers Grant from Creative Capital for her book project on Ray Johnson. the artist who will feature in Johanna's talk today. And since 2018, she has served as executive editor of Media and Journal of the New Media Caucus. And without further ado, I pass the mic to Johanna.
So first, I want to thank Inessa and Lucas and Lolita for inviting me to speak at this wonderful event, and to Gedrius for the technical support, and of course to Ara, Jonathan, and Chrissie for their beautiful and rich talks. And I'm very much looking forward to the discussion as well. So my talk today is a little bit different in tone. It's called How to Make a Scene, Ray Johnson and Jonas Mekas as Underground Publicists. And like my predecessors, I will probably mispronounce Mekas as well because of habit. Of course, the very notion here of an underground publicist is a bit of an oxymoron. What does it mean to promote a subterranean movement engaged in semi-secretive and potentially even illicit activities? In the following, I investigate this paradox, first by positioning Ray Johnson's mail art as a sort of foil for Mekas's own approach to publicity, and then by analyzing how criticisms of Mekas point to persistent tensions and anxieties within the underground around the role of class, labor, and finance. Add to the record books, a showing of Andy Warhol's movie Kiss was banned at the University of Manitoba. So begins Mekas's weekly movie journal column from the November 12th, 1964 issue of The Village Voice. More than 6 months after his arrest on obscenity charges for screening Flaming Creatures, Mekas remains outraged over censorship of underground cinema and relatedly the lack of financial and institutional support available to those whom he considers its brightest talents. He argues that censorship is not simply a question of artistic freedom, but it's also an economic obstacle that leaves the avant-garde filmmaker living hand to mouth. Under the heading Going Hungry, he reports on Jack Smith's recent trip to Mexico to visit a destitute Ron Rice. Quote, from his description, things are pretty bad down in Mexico. Ron is going hungry. He is living in the Stone Age, says Jack. Mekas casts blame on the, quote, New York police and city bureaucrats who will not permit Rice to show his films and would rather see him starve to death in Mexico, which leads him to threaten, I am ready to take up a gun when I think about this and open a real underground. I may do that one day. Working in tandem with the state are the museums and foundations who favor what Mekas considers pedestrian and vulgar projects over risk-taking underground art. To drive home this hypocrisy, Mekas designates Smith and Rice alongside Stan Brakhage and Gregory Markopoulos as the, quote, old masters of the future metropolitans, a prescient and in many ways self-fulfilling declaration considering our reason for gathering here today. He quotes Brackage's complaint that money problems keep him on the road, touring and giving guest lectures. As Brakhage puts it, quote, moving, ranging back and forth across this wasted, hellish landscape of a country. Mekas grimly proclaims, this is the true story of the avant-garde artist, not the one you read in national magazines, the simple daily survival, not to starve to death. He concludes with an anecdote about an anonymous filmmaker who, weak with hunger, lingers outside a restaurant kitchen in order to catch a whiff of the aroma of food cooking inside, a tale that seems torn straight out of a Dickens novel. This sense of outrage on behalf of the underground, coupled with a deep and abiding conviction in its artistic significance, all presented with melodramatic flair, typifies the quasi-evangelical tone of movie journal during this period. Mekas sounds almost like a minister, calling out the hypocrisies of the wealthy and powerful while urging his congregation to help feed the hungry and clothe the poor. Among the readers of Movie Journal that week was apparently Ray Johnson, an artist who, like Mekas, was also carefully cultivating his reputation within the New York underground. But instead of evangelizing on behalf of that scene, Johnson was more inclined to deflate and mock his fellow artists' attempts at institutional legitimacy, success, or simply rising out of obscurity. A case in point is Johnson's reply to Mekas's column from November 12th, which was published in the following week's Letters to the Editor section. And as just an aside, this discovery is what prompted the curators of this exhibition to reach out to me and invite me to present today. So I thank them for picking up on that. Titled Needy, Johnson's letter reads, quote, "Dear Sir, help, please add my name to the Jonas Mekas list of serious needy artists. I had to have my right leg amputated last week and don't get around much anymore. I'm trying to scrape up enough dough to go to Kashmir to feed to the fertile valleys in the south, the Happy Valley, to feed chickens. I try hard to put on a nice show once a year of my best work. Some folks dig it and hang it on their walls. Ray Johnson, Suffolk Street." So Needy obviously contains more than a few hints at its insincerity, from its pitiful title, which reads more like a pseudonym of the kind used in advice columns, to its absurdly pathetic tale of deprivation, amputation, and back to the land escapist fantasy. The line, "I don't get around much anymore," borrows from the lyrics of a Duke Ellington jazz standard about rejection and heartbreak, and adds a doleful edge to Johnson's desire to scrape up enough dough to move to Kashmir, which reads here as a pastiche of Ron Rice's poverty-stricken exile in Mexico. Read alongside the jazz lyrics, his references to the Happy Valley skewer the counterculture's idealization of subaltern locales, Eastern spirituality, and of course, permissive cannabis use. What Mexico had been to the beats, India would be for hippies. The closing lines, "I try hard to put on a nice show once a year. Some folks dig it and hang it on their waltz," drips with feigned humility and self-abasement, while the misspelling of walls as waltz reads like one last final dig at Mekas's heavily accented English. Clearly, Johnson saw an easy target in Movie Journal's indignant musings about persecuted starving artists and unjustly neglected old masters. It's tempting to chalk his snarky tone up to a narcissism of minor differences, since both artists were similarly engaged in building artistic scenes and organizations, expanding social artistic networks, and frankly, to self-promotion. By the mid-60s, Johnson was a highly visible figure in the downtown scene. He lived openly as a queer man and had gained attention for his proto-pop art collages, and increasingly for his mail art practice, which I've collected a sort of some samples of for you here. He launched this practice in the mid-50s when he started distributing his work through the mail to friends and associates. And in 1962, he coined this practice, his postal network, the New York Correspondence School, a punning title that conjoins the New York School of Abstract Expressionist Painting with the dodgy mail order artistic training offered by so-called correspondence art schools. Under the auspices of his school, Johnson sent announcements, collages, flyers, letters, postcards, questionnaires, circulars, newspaper clippings, postcards, and so on, to an ever-evolving network of correspondence, which included much of the downtown scene and, of course, the writers and editors of the Village Voice, which printed a number of his missives over the years, including the needy letter to the editor. Yet Johnson's correspondence school was not a straightforward PR machine. As mentioned, the title of the school references and conflates two mutually opposed modes of artistic production: the heroic modernism of AbX, an elite fine art form exhibited in galleries and museums and written about by scholars and critics, and on the other hand, the questionable phenomenon of correspondence schools, often advertised in the backs of magazines or on matchbook covers and on subway placards. These businesses would solicit aspiring amateur artists to make a sketch or tracing, usually of a cartoon animal like a rabbit or a turtle, and mail it in with promises of professional training, scholarships, and ultimately a successful career in commercial or advertising art, the industry in which Johnson himself worked in the 1950s, just like his friend Andy Warhol. Johnson parodied correspondence art schools with his signature bunny head cartoon avatar and his frequent step-by-step instructions on how to draw a bunny, as well as asking his correspondents to please add to a mailing and then send it on to another recipient, thus expanding his network in a sort of pyramid scheme-like fashion. By conflating these two mutually opposed schools of high and low brow art under one banner, the New York Correspondence School also suggests a parallel between the desperate sincerity of aspiring amateur artists and the overbearing earnestness of abstract expressionism's romantic rhetoric. And I'm thinking here of Barnett Newman's declaration in his 1948 essay, The Sublime Is Now, that the New York School was, quote, making cathedrals out of our own feelings. Conflating this high and low understanding of artistic labor, Johnson suggests that both models are founded on hyperbolic and misleading claims for art as a means of transcendence, whether economic or spiritual. Promises that were destined to be tested, if not broken, for any artist trying to make it in New York, let alone as part of the underground. Likewise, the pathetic artist described in Needy is just as likely to be a commercial artist as an abstract painter. Johnson's twofold critique of art as a means, Johnson's critique adds context to his antipathy, I think, towards Mekas's lofty language and his very serious writerly persona in Movie Journal. Mekas often referred to Anthology Film Archives as a sort of cathedral, and visitors would describe their visits, their visits to screenings as a weekly ritual akin to attending church. Facing such reverential language, it's easy to imagine Johnson deploying his New York Correspondence School to snap back, the New York Correspondence School has no history, only a camel, and quack. However, I think it might be too easy to just classify Mekas as more of a romantic modernist in line with Newman, and Johnson as a queer postmodernist closer in spirit to Warhol, and just leave it at that. One could interpret Johnson's letter in a somewhat more affectionate light if we consider his and Mekas's common artistic investments, and particularly their shared love of 19th century French poetry, specifically Charles Baudelaire and Arthur Rimbaud. As we know, Mekas frequently referred to Smith, Rice, and others as part of a Baudelairean cinema, and he also referenced Rimbaud in his writings. I'd wager that Mekas likely owned a copy of this New Directions Press 1957 reissue of Rimbaud's Illuminations with its famous Ben Day dot cover that was actually designed by Ray Johnson. Similarly, Johnson paid homage to Baudelaire in the title of his correspondence school through his frequent and deliberate misspellings of correspondence with an A to spell sort of correspondance in the Francophone style, which is a reference to one of Baudelaire's most famous poems. That said, poetry isn't the subject of this letter to the editor. It's the business end of art that's on the agenda, and Mekas's rhetoric and persona that's in Johnson's crosshairs. But more than just a passing taunt, I think Needy also points towards a meta-commentary on Mekas's style of publicity and his inward rather than outward-facing reputation amongst the underground. Whereas Mekas's publicity was very sincere and aimed at tangible financial, institutional, and legal results, Johnson's publicity through his mail art was deliberately self-defeating, a stream of miscellaneous information, irrelevant gossip, phony announcements, in-jokes, and other deflationary gestures that mimicked the art world's own institutional publicity mechanisms and its reputational economies, the very same systems that Mekas was attempting to leverage on behalf of the neglected underground filmmaker. So beyond these contrasts and parallels in their respective practices and sensibilities, Johnson and Mekas were also peers within a shared social milieu, and they frequently intersected as audience members or participants in events and gatherings at the Living Theater, Judson Dance, Happenings, Fluxus Performance, Warhol's Factory, the experimental music scene, and so forth, histories that Andrew Urosky and Melissa Ragona detail beautifully in their respective catalog essays for this exhibition. We've also heard just from Chrissie right now about this, this sort of robust scene. Of particular social relevance for this connection between Mekas and Johnson is their mutual involvement in Jack Smith's Flaming Creatures. Whereas Mekas's advocacy for the film is well documented and quite notorious, less known is Johnson's presence during the film's production when he facilitated a behind-the-scenes photo shoot by his friend Norman Solomon. Shot mainly on the roof of the Windsor Theater one afternoon in the summer of 1962, a selection of these photographs are reproduced in Jay Hoberman's book on the making of Flaming Creatures. 2 of the unpublished photographs from this series show Johnson, and apologies for these Xeroxes, this is the best I've been able to locate of these photographs. I'm concerned that they're actually lost now. These unpublished photographs depict Johnson and who is somebody who is identified as Jack Smith, but I'm open to questions on that, sitting between takes, this sort of index of a friendship or an affinity between them that could have actually provided another motivation behind Johnson's letter to the editor. Written in the wake of Mekas's very public campaign on behalf of Flaming Creatures, we might further speculate that Johnson's aggression was fueled by a burgeoning suspicion, akin to Smith's own, that Mekas's dogged efforts to turn Flaming Creatures into a cause célèbre might ultimately overshadow the work and the filmmaker himself. To the extent that Mekas's reputation was starting to eclipse the queer avant-garde he was ostensibly advocating for, Johnson's barbed language here becomes increasingly legible as a very passive-aggressive form of critique. Of course, my reading here is largely circumstantial and presumes a queer affiliation between Johnson and Smith that may not have actually existed. A somewhat more reliable piece of evidence to support my reading of this letter as a critique comes in the form of a 1965 profile in the New York Times published on the occasion of Johnson's one-man show at the Willard Gallery. And this was a very rare occasion as an underground artist, somebody who dodged the spotlight as much as he courted it. So in the profile, the Times' art critic Grace Gluck declares Johnson perhaps the most famous unknown artist in New York, which is like underground publicist, a bit of an oxymoron. Johnson describes his reticence to exhibit in official galleries and his penchant for selling work to collectors directly. Occasionally, he says, I visit collectors with a box of collages wrapped in newspaper under my arm, like a Fuller Brush man. That pleases me. I've shown them on Mies van der Rohe tables all over town. Who was the Fuller Brush man? Well, a staple of mid-century suburbia, he was a door-to-door salesman who, alongside his female counterpart, the Fuller Brush girl, was considered a sort of very respected and reliable dealer of domestic cleaning products and cosmetics. As salesmen, the Fuller Brushmen were independent operators who worked alone, but maintained an affiliation with the national franchise. They were an organized workforce, but geographically dispersed, neither exclusively self-employed nor beholden to a managerial hierarchy. The term for this kind of business model is networked marketing, not to be confused with multi-level marketing, which is an actual pyramid scheme. And in the post-war period, the Fuller Brushman was considered one of the most trustworthy of this kind. His clean-cut image and friendly smile befitting a Norman Rockwell cover for the Saturday Evening Post. And indeed, the Fuller Brushman actually inspired 2 slapstick comedies, one 1948 vehicle starring Red Skelton and a 1950 follow-up with Lucille Ball. For an artist like Johnson, whose practice was dedicated to cultivating networks, it should be no surprise that his ideal sales method was similarly networked. By admiring the image of himself displaying his wares on Mies van der Rohe tables, Johnson paints a picture of post-war American prosperity in which the artist entrepreneur interacts directly with his collector consumer without interference from either the art market nor the nonprofit arts institutions that Mekas was demanding support from and would increasingly begin to build for the community. Mekas and Johnson continued to make cameos in one another's work. For instance, Johnson appears in Walden, where he's shown performing a stilt walk in Central Park along with a group of children. I'm going to show a short clip.
It feels so one can just sit and watch these images.
So this fleeting cameo, I think, testifies to their ongoing relationship, a sort of friendliness or an acquaintanceship, and to Mekas's awareness of Johnson's performance activities. This stilt walk would have been something he promoted, announced via the New York Correspondence School. A decade later, Johnson included Mekas's name in his 1978 mailing, Ray Johnson's History of Video Art, a very disorganized genealogy featuring lopsided rows of his bunny head icon labeled with the names of video pioneers like Namjoon Paik, Joan Jonas, Shigeki Kubota, and Stan Vanderbeek, as well as a few more questionable influences like Shelley Duvall and Walt Whitman. Johnson maps video's history across the flyover states of Idaho, Colorado, Michigan, and video's geographic epicenter of New York State. The only apparent explanation for this map is that each of these states contains a town called Ovid, a partial anagram of the word video that also makes a sort of coded reference to the ancient Greek mythologist of metamorphosis. A native of Detroit and longtime Long Island resident, the presence of Michigan and New York could have potential autobiographical significance for Johnson, whereas the inclusion of rugged Western states like Idaho and Colorado could be intended to evoke the concept of an American pioneer or bootstrapper, a role that applies to Johnson, most of the artists on this roster, including Mekas. It's worth noting that each of the bunny heads with Asian language names, including Namjoon Paik, Nam Feb Paik, and Nam March Paik, are drawn with thin, downward slanting eyes, a caricature of the epicanthic fold that evokes common racist epithets. Additionally, many of these racialized bunny heads are stamped Brew Eyes Crub, a xenophobic linguistic stereotype, similar to his use of waltz to mock Mekas's accent. These racist caricatures signal a breakdown in the playful and utopian spirit that's typically attributed to Johnson's work and demonstrate his propensity for aggression and mockery, or to borrow the more recent parlance of social media, trolling. Part publicity, part troll, the history of video art points to Mekas's elevated status as a figurehead, but also as a target, a literal bunny rabbit in Johnson's crosshairs. It's worth mentioning here, I think, that Johnson's use of derogatory caricature also recalls Jack Smith's villainization of Mekas as the archetypal Uncle Fishhook, a vicious agent of capitalist exploitation as part of Smith's broader cosmology of landlordism, as detailed in his off-quoted 1978 interview with Sylvain Lautringer, Uncle Fishhook and the Sacred Baby Poo-Poo of Art. So despite being a mere squib, Johnson's 1964 letter to the editor actually anticipates and resonates with some of the more pointed accusations leveled against Mekas by his more disgruntled associates, infamously Jack Smith, but also Bay Area artist and filmmaker Bruce Conner, whose pen was nearly as poisonous. In a letter exchange printed in the 1969 issue of Canyon Cinema News, Conner accuses Mekas of withholding rental fees and his rightful share of ticket sales, as well as general mismanagement, ineptitude, and favoritism towards his New York filmmaker friends. Conner takes particular aim at Mekas's publicity activities and concludes his screed by stating, quote, "Jonas has been involved in promotion of the most inept homosexual drivel to come out of New York. He has been more interested in playing public relations than presenting films in the best possible context." Of course, Mekas immediately fired back with a letter that turns incredulous and incensed, in which he debunks all of Conner's claims, repeatedly calling bullshit. Variations on the word bullshit appear 7 times in total in the letter. Mekas concludes that Conner is a greedy bullshitter who may need a good spanking more than anybody else. So whether needy or greedy, mocking or deathly serious, delusional or bullshitting queer shade or homophobic screed, critiques of Mekas share a common impulse to really hit him where it hurt the most, which is in his reputation as the underground's altruistic patron saint, as a sort of bohemian mendicant. Rather than retroactively try to adjudicate these critiques, my interest here lies more in tracing what they can tell us about certain economic anxieties amongst a dispersed group of artists with various commitments and affiliations, without collapsing them into a single camp. I want to just remind us that Conner's comment about homosexual drivel puts him directly at odds with Johnson and Jack Smith, as do his accusations of favoritism towards New York artists. What I find most revealing about this exchange is not actually Conner's allegations, but rather Mekas's opening self-defense, where he identifies himself as a farmer. twice within the first paragraph. Mekas's concept of a farmer would not have been the sort of the industrial agricultural scale that Connor would have grown up with in the American heartland of Wichita, Kansas. Instead, Mekas is clearly referencing his own childhood in the rural Lithuanian village of Emigré, where his parents were peasant farmers. Mekas fondly referenced his early life as a farm boy who cared for sheep and cows. And by claiming the title of farmer in his defense, he is, of course, aligning himself with a sort of folksy, down-to-earth common sense and a lack of pretense or guile. But he's also, I think, making an implicit pastoral claim for underground cinema and for the institutions he founded to sustain and nourish it. Mekas later echoed this pastoral analogy 30 years later in the 1999 film Laboratorium Anthology, in which, as Herb Schellenberger notes, he describes Anthology Film Archives as not so much a cinematic laboratory, but a farm. We are farmers, he states. We are growing so many different things here. I think I am a farmer, and this is a big farm. So to refer to Anthology as a farm is not just a metaphor. I think it's an economic claim. A family farm of the kind that Mekas grew up on is one that is more oriented towards subsistence than expansion, meaning it's scaled to facilitate a family's survival and self-maintenance rather than to generate capital or penetrate new markets. To the contrary, Connor writes about huge audiences. He estimates 400 people came to a screening of his film, another thing that Jonas says is bullshit. And these wide profit margins, and conjures up images of Mekas cooking the books and withholding his rightful shares of the profit. For Connor, involvement with institutions was strictly transactional, whereas for Mekas, it is simply delusional for Connor to imagine that avant-garde film could ever turn a profit, let alone survive without communal, public, or charitable support. Neither Connor nor Mekas, though, is really a con artist or a bullshitter. Their disagreement actually boils down not to actual accounting discrepancies, but rather to antithetical understandings of how artistic labor should be valued and compensated, and more generally to competing understandings of the relationship and obligation between the artist and the community in which he operates. So in short, I think this is fundamentally an ideological conflict regarding the status of the individual waged between two artists for whom individual was actually tantamount. Individualism, I should say, was tantamount. Looking back again to Johnson's 1964 letter to the editor, its abrasive tone can be similarly traced to competing models of artistic labor and individualism, with Johnson aspiring to be like the entrepreneurial Fuller Brushman, pushing one foot through the door as the trusted representative of an established brand, linked by reputation, but bearing no economic responsibility to his fellow salesmen. In keeping with the broader cultural ethos of the West Coast counterculture, Connor's understanding of artistic individualism is much more libertarian. He regards himself as a free agent who can negotiate within a market-based economy made up of exclusively numbers, contractual agreements, and percentages, not virtuous intentions or community feeling. Whether they modeled their careers after the franchise salesman or a small business owner, Johnson and Connor both understand themselves as independent agents, responsible for their own success, and thus found themselves at odds with the self-proclaimed farmer of the avant-garde, promoter of scenes, builder of institutions. Of course, Mekas held many other titles and wore many other hats besides farmer. He was the, quote, showman come spokesperson, as Ed Halter describes him in his brilliant catalog essay for this exhibition. Reviewing the literature on Mekas, it is awash with descriptors that often confuse or conflate the heroic, the spiritual, and the commercial. He was an impresario, a poet, a Pied Piper, a monk, high priest, saint, conscience, sage, guru, and most revealingly for Halter, even the, quote, New York underground Barnum, an entrepreneur par excellence. By positioning himself at center stage sometimes, Mekas also made himself a target for criticism and even ire from the community of artists and filmmakers he tried to champion. These conflicts illuminate some of the politics and divisions within the underground, particularly over questions of class, labor, and money, as much, if not more so, than examining the wider official culture that it opposed. The fact that Mekas often triggered such a strong reaction, I think, demonstrates that his role as publicist, which was ultimately rooted in his generosity towards other artists, could often be a double-edged sword. And moreover, that the machinations of publicity help uncover how artists understood themselves in relationship to one another and to the capitalist system in which they lived, worked, and struggled, both collectively and as individuals. Thank you.
Thank you, Johanna, and thank you all for your incredible intellectual input in what we imagined as a sort of, as I said in the beginning, so sort of the idea of opening new portals, sort of new trajectories in Mekas scholarship. And I think I can say, Lucas thinks the same, that we succeeded. It was super interesting to listen to all of you, and thank you for that. Thank you for your incredible input into this endeavor of ours. And before we open up floor for the audience to ask the questions, I want to ask the panelists to please pose any questions or comments if you have. It's your time now, and would be very, very interested in hearing your ideas first. If you have any.
A question for Chrissie. Yeah. It's more of a clarification question. I was taking lots of notes during your wonderful talk, and I was wondering, I just missed a little bit. If you could explain more these sort of peripatetic accommodation or houses that you were describing in Berlin in the Weimar period. They seem to serve a lot of functions, and I sort of lost my understanding of what they were.
Yes, let me go back to my notes on those. Let's see. Just want to make sure I have the right notes when I'm. Yeah, the Laubenkolonien, they were called. There were two kinds of these sort of informal architectures. One was the sort of, and they appeared in the 19th century first. One was Laubenkolonien, and the other was Schrebergarten. And the Laubenkolonien grew up really during the Weimar period. The Schrebergarten appeared in the 19th century as industrialization created a kind of more densely populated kind of sort of suffocating, sort of city as it sort of developed in the big cities, and especially Berlin in Germany. And so the Schrebergarten started out as these places where people could grow their own food and relax and have a kind of breath of fresh air in the countryside, aside from apartment buildings. I guess in England they're called allotment gardens. But the Laubenkolonien came slightly later in the Weimar period, and it really sort of happened after the First World War that they sort of developed as these kind of illegal. It's kind of illegal housing. And, as I mentioned, they illegally housed 35,000 demobbed soldiers and the poor in general during the 1920s in Germany, and especially Berlin. And they were these sort of temporary huts and homemade structures. They didn't have electricity or plumbing, quite similar to the flux houses when Maciunas and Jonas first got to Soho and Worcester Street, and they also became these in a way, spaces of fugitivity. So the Jewish community hid there during the war and World War II, also political radicals, the resistance. They were places where you could hide and also be independent. So, you know, this sense of also their precarity, because to this day, some of them still remain, but to this day they're threatened by, of course, now gentrification. But the sort of informal architecture of them really existed outside the control of the authorities. So they were useful because, especially because of the bombings, and then after the war, they were, you know, when so many were made homeless, so the authorities didn't crack down on them in a heavy way, but they just operated as this kind of this very sort of this place aside from, or kind of outside of the control of the authorities, in a way that just resonates for me with what Jonas and Jonas were doing first, and then the way in which George Baker argues that the Laubenkolonien and photography appeared together, first in the 19th century and the Schrebergarten, and then in the early 20s, as, you know, what George describes as this a loss of unitary sense of social space, producing a multiplication of unanchorable sites. So that resonated to me with Jonas's, you know, the itineracy of the cinema, the Cinematheque, and also the precarity of it and of the spaces, the Fluxhausen.
Thank you so much. I found that utterly fascinating, those connections that you were making. I'm so grateful to hear more.
Thank you.
If no one wants to ask any other question or make a comment, and I know that Lucas has at least one question, me too, and I got this idea of before I ask a question, just a brief comment, sort of joining your Ara presentation with just the Chrissie's comment, that when you notice that Mekas' sort of inclusion in his films, the evidence of, or sort of the traces of the material conditions that enable him to make these you know, to actually to film, and I've never thought, I mean, it just occurred to me that these material conditions are also the infrastructure, the sort of the community, the spaces that he inhabits with others, and in a way we also talk about it in the exhibition, or sort of have an open question, leave it as it is, how the sort of these you know, the many roles or many hats that Mekas wore, how this plays with his practice as a filmmaker, and what is the sort of the overlapping and what is the relationship between the artist as someone who makes an artwork, and an artist who is also organizing stuff or building the infrastructure of the avant-garde film culture as we frame it. But my question is provoked by the last two papers, but please feel free to answer anyone who want to who has any ideas about it. I wonder, I mean, we talk about the relation, in the exhibition, we think about Mekas as a sort of, we imagine him as a sort of what we frame as a century frugal figure, always being in connection with others, like making, his films, but also organizing, building this big infrastructure, but always in connection with other people. And this is one of the sort of the narrative that drives our exhibition, is to show sort of these relationships, implicit or explicit. But I was thinking that though we quite often, or most often, talk about these relationships in terms of friendships, but here we have the idea of a conflict, and I wonder whether what's your opinion about it? Whether there is a place for conflict in the collective as a productive sort of force.
I think I'll do that one because I think that's probably connected to my argument. Yeah, obviously, one of my contentions here is that friendship is not free of antagonism, and antagonism is actually not just generative, but it's inevitable, particularly in resource-starved situations. And particularly in situations like we see here, where we talk about the underground, but we're talking about intersecting scenes. We're talking about part of, without creating a whole elaborate like social history of this moment, I think what I'm trying to place together is by having both sort of a member of the queer underground who's more on the visual art side of things, who's not a filmmaker, but who's traveling within those circles, and then having a West Coast filmmaker like Connor involved, is to show these sort of the dispersal of this concept of the underground, but also the mutual antagonisms, fractures. I think of them, I refer to them elsewhere as sort of more like hairline fractures than total ruptures or breakdowns. There are things that we can trace the sort of lines of, and they trace back to some fundamental disagreements. And that's what I'm trying to unpack here is we have some competing understandings of labor, of the relationship between the artist and capital. And we could, expand on where that's coming from, but I'm using sort of these models of the farmer or the salesman in order to help unpack that. And I think obviously we're also talking about mid-century America in a lot of ways, and we're talking also about sort of the Cold War. So that's my very general answer, but I appreciate you, picking up on the antagonism is sort of definitely what I'm trying to trace here.
Something I started thinking about a little bit when I was writing my talk, but also I'm teaching this whole class on Mekas's work this semester, which has been just wonderful. A lot of my students are here with us today. Is the relationship between contingency and necessity. And that's something that P. Adams talks about a lot in his book, Eyes Upside Down. And I can't really like spell it out, the relation, but there's like the Jonas that is blown by the winds, whose life is like upended, who sort of accidentally makes these films, his embrace of contingency through the lens. And then there's the Jonas who actively builds institutions and always finds a way and always raises money, even though he resents tremendously that part of his life. And that's like the necessity. But I don't think of contingency and necessity as being like diametrically opposed. Like in Jonas's life, we see how they're not, that the contingency like informs the necessity, that he had to make a home for these institutions. He had to make a distribution center. He had to make a cooperative, an exhibition center. And I think one of the, when I say he's the most important American filmmaker in the post-war period, I know that not a lot of people agree with me, although I think they might come to, but it's because of both of those things. It's because of his work as a filmmaker and his role as an institution builder that it is unimaginable to think of the New York downtown art scene without his advocacy, without his labor, without his creation of a community. And Johanna, I loved we're all of us are getting these like European like inflections to our names today. I was Ara Osterweil, and you can be Johanna today. But I loved your quoting Mekas about the farm, about the co-op as a farm. I love that idea, but that's why I think he was so important, because he did both. He not only made these extraordinary films, but he made a community in which that was even possible. And that's why, like I'm sure some of us, I've seen the Velvet Underground doc by Todd Haynes. It's like more and more it's becoming recognized how indispensable he was to so many different scenes. So that's my answer.
Maybe I'll ask a brief question. It probably sounds a little more theoretical, but I was thinking specifically in relation to Ara's, yours, and Jonathan's presentations. What I found somewhat super interesting and striking that both of you really focused on something what we can call maybe like a specific material aspect of a physical world in Mekas films and even beyond them. You talked about like elemental, but I found also very fascinating that Jonathan very surprisingly in the at first sight to me brought the Bazanian film theory in dialogue with Mekas' work, and I immediately remember some other like texts by Bazan and like his famous ontology of photographic image, which is sometimes I think misread in a way that is considered as like something only about kind of index, and when other texts are misread for being considered as like only about kind of aesthetics of a long take, and I find always Bazan way more complex in a way that this ontological realism as kind of goes together with this ethical realism and his interest in a way almost ethical and sometimes political acknowledgement of ambiguity or contingency, as Ara mentioned. And then, so I was thinking, since you both noted Mekas' inclusion of evidence of his situatedness in the material world into his acts of filmmaking, and how essential they are for understanding Mekas' aesthetics and ethics, I wanted to ask maybe even broader question. Could we talk about some kind of political or like kind of politics of including the material physical world as and at the same time sort of making the cinema more centrifugal, more eccentric, as some kind of Mekas consistent idea of cinema, opposing the existent cinema. Can we talk about something beyond aesthetics? You are talking a lot about ethics, but like I was thinking, where can we go from here? Because I'm really feel that we're like really touching upon like something very important in analyzing his work, which I haven't yet read much. I mean, that Sydney writes a lot about that, but like if you talk even about a contingency and the central kind of centrifugal approach to cinema beyond films, expanded like advocacy for expanded cinema, sort of getting bigger. Like, so I was thinking beyond aesthetics, what else it could lead us to? Maybe some ideas. Sorry, maybe not so like I still haven't clearly formulated the question, but I'm just sharing my thoughts.
Well, good.
Actually, sorry, no, Ara, please.
No, I want you to go first.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, so this is just off the top of my head in response to what you said, I think that one theme that I think comes up in all of the talks, and in all of the talks, there's something about documentation, whether that's the documentation of an artist's life by that artist or by someone else, or just sort of documentation of a scene, a place, a time, a series of events, and there's always something missing, and I think that starting with aesthetics, well, I suppose starting with where aesthetics and the material realities of Jonas's life meet is that that frequently when Jonas talks about the rapidity of his editing and his pixelating style, it may have as much to do with money or other kinds of material circumstances as anything else. That there are sometimes when he can't shoot very much. And that may be the contingencies of a particular situation he's in, where he's doing other things, having dinner with people, for instance. In other cases, again, it may have to do with money. And the inability of filmmakers to complete work is often something that he talks about in his movie journal columns. I'm thinking, for example, of a reference to Ken Jacobs that I just happened to read while I was writing this, is that, Ken Jacobs has all these films that he's working on that he can't finish, and then in parentheses, money, money, money. And so there's a way in which I think that, and Jacobs is another filmmaker who I think does this, is that they take the kind of gappiness, rough-hewn, raw quality of their own films, not strictly as an aesthetic for its own sake, but as I suppose in a Bazinian sense, an index of, say, their poverty, which is itself a sign of their marginalization. And, so there's a way in which we could look at a whole series of, say, lyrical films by various filmmakers and to see hallmarks of that style that are evident in Jonas's work, but they're there for a different reason. They're there out of a necessity of working with contingency, to sort of build on Ara's point. And just to conclude this remark, one thing I wanted to include in my talk but didn't is that Bazin's essay on cinema and exploration, which is really sort of about travel documentaries and such, which is in the first volume in English of What is Cinema. He talks about the film Kon-Tiki, where the filmmakers tried to recreate a very perilous journey across the ocean in boats that would have been built by so-called primitive cultures, that there was a camera operator on the scene, but very often when something really serious was happening, like a storm, the camera operator had to be doing other things. And so Bazin finds this such an authentically realistic film because it's missing footage. It couldn't be made, but that absence is an index of the peril that the filmmakers were experiencing. So there's another way in which that's a very strange version of realism. It's something that's not even in the film, that one simply has to know, that kind of fills in those gaps. So I think and this of course requires some kind of external knowledge, extra textual knowledge, but it's knowledge of the conditions of poverty and marginalization that inform the look of the film as much as aesthetic ideals, whether about realism or modernism.
That's a great answer, Jonathan. I was, in my mad dash to cut my talk, which I tried so many times, I had a lot of your slides in my talk. I had a lot of that Lumiere stuff. And so I was thinking, we were really thinking alike in some ways about the attention to like the Bazinian, which I think, Lucas, you're right. Like that's not what people think about when they see Jonas's films, because you know, Bazan's love of the long take and Renoir and stuff. And here we have the cinema of like chopped up little bits, right? And so how is that the real? There's this great moment at the end of Walden where Jonas, he's inside at the editing table and he's trying to, he's sort of like giving his theory of the real. He's shooting the camera through the window. And well, first he shows you like all of these like skaters in Central Park in the middle of the snow. And he's like, in the background, you know, we see this. He keeps saying, in the background, we see this. And then he's at his editing table and we hear the music that he's playing while he's sitting at his editing table. And we see like the world framed through the window. And for Jonas, I think the real is both of those things simultaneously. It's the world out there, but it's also the real moment of the artist's work and the framing of it and recognizing that there's a distance between that. And for Jonas, I think he was always like the perennial outsider. He was the consummate insider and the perennial outsider. And you see that like through the window frame. In the background, which he says in his like highly accented voice, in the background, and then in the inside, right? And he's like trying, that's the real. And I think, you know, I was really happy, Jonathan, you brought up John Pruitt's essay where he's really thinking about like Jonas's really weird but interesting idea of the real. And that's in, you know, of course, the book From David James to Free the Cinema. And John Pruitt is a long time beloved professor at Bard College. But the politics of the image, you know, that's such an important question. And the relationship between politics and aesthetics. And Jonas, from what I understand, was like allergic to politics and as suspicious of the left as he was of the right, even though he tried to be like a good social documentarian in the style of WPA when he first came to the US. He became really suspicious of sponsorship, of all. He knew that politics of any stripe would make mince of the artist's soul. And so then it seems like it's apolitical, but, you know, but of course it's not. And Jonas knew it wasn't, you know, in his, what I think of his masterpiece, As I Was Moving Ahead, he keeps saying, this is a political film. This is a political film. This is a political film. And first of all, you know, he has this column in Movie Journal, like Fighting Ugliness with Ugliness. And he talks about how the world's so ugly and politics and war are so ugly. And to think that like, artists should have to make things that are so ugly that shows that ugliness is like not really a way to fight the ugliness. That to fight the ugliness is to fight it with beauty. That like the reason one resists is because like this is what the world looks like and this is worth fighting for. And he shows that in Walden. Like this is what the world that one wants to preserve away from war and destruction. But again, like I think that you know, you were asking Lucas about like the material, the evidence of that. And I think that, you know, that's why I was trying to make that analogy between the inclusion of the black frame in those Sonderkommando photos and the inclusion of like the evidence of the active filmmaking in not only in Mekas's work, but in so much work from that period. Because we have to remember that these were like a bunch of misfits in the Cold War, that's why they gravitated towards each other. Like Mekas's FBI file was released yesterday, you know, after all of these years. And it's because like to engage in filmmaking in public, on the street, outside of capitalism was an affront to capitalism itself. To break the logic of capitalism, to make images in public outside for a group of friends in a network that resisted capitalism is a political act. It's not the same kind of political act as taking those photos at Auschwitz, but it's related. So that's my answer. Thank you for a wonderful question, deep question.
I also think that what both of you just said and what you just said is related to my earlier comment about the Lauben colony and illegal housing and informal architecture, because those conditions in New York were essential for what you're describing and what Jonas worked on and developed. It would be impossible to do now because hypercapitalism has taken over every last corner of New York City. from the demolishing of the East River Park recently, the Lower East Side, Chinatown, all those spaces that Jonas worked in, the old theaters, they're all gone. They're all taken over by generic glass buildings. And, you know, Mussolini said fascism is glass. And, you know, there's no boundary between you and the authority that puts up that glass. And glass means there's nowhere to go. You know, Jonas, I had nowhere to go. In fact, relative to now, he found those places to go. And those places to go, that's why I find it so interesting that Los Ingravidas are they're anonymous for the reasons of their safety, because their films are political, but they're also online. Not exclusively, but where do you go now? The erosion of that sort of, the space of the street, so brightly lit. I mean, the cinematic is experienced in so much of what we're talking about in darkness. It's impossible to have darkness or shadow or secrecy when you're surrounded by glass. And that's why the Serbian poet I found so moving, because he's talking about that moment of bombarding this glass city with rays of light. It's almost like a sort of cinematic metaphor of, you know, really, really challenging the politics of transparency. And Jonas, in a way, was gathering around everyone who were kind of creating the opposite. And I think that it's only in the dark that things can grow.
Can I add just one final plug? It's not really a conclusion, but I think one text guiding my thinking for my talk was definitely Paul Arthur's Routines of Emancipation, in terms of tracing the sort of contradictions around the role of the artist and the counterculture, the internal contradictions of the 60s counterculture. And I think revisiting that text has definitely helped me unpack some of these persistent tensions between, like, as Ara says, to claim to not be political is a political act. And there is, Mekas constantly would say, well, I'm more interested in sort of what later became termed the lifestyle counterculture, like living alternatively rather than being on the front lines in the streets, and this sort of uneasy tension that Arthur describes between filmmakers, artist filmmakers, and the new left. And so I feel like that text has been really, it's generative. It can still sort of sustains has a punch. And so I just wanted to put in a plug for Paul Arthur at the tail end of our conversation.
Thank you. I was also reminded of one film, very short film by Mekas, Cassis, where you may know the story that there's a failure which is integral in the film as an aesthetic, but also I think very much plays into what you were all talking about, the sort of political level, where the tripod that he constructs breaks down, but he decides to leave it like that, and the camera starts swinging, though initially it should have stayed, fixed. And he 4 minutes short film, but I think it plays very well into what you were all talking about, the sort of thinking about what the filming is and sort of showing these conditions, not trying to, though you need to, as Jonathan remarked, sometimes you need to know it from the outside sources, this kind of information, but sort of leaving these traces as indexical traces in the film, something which is, I think, very powerful in Mekas films. But also I follow the chat and try to see if yes, if there are any questions. And I received one from my colleague via Messenger, because she's not on the Zoom chat, and I will try to ask. So Juste Kostikovaite asks what kind of correlations there may be between Mekas' work in film and film curation, and his writing practice, writing as a critic, but also as a poet, and whether there are any changes that happen within time between these two poles of activities, filmmaking and writing. I don't know who wants to. Ara, yes, please.
No. I think that's a question for Chrissie. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the curation aspect.
Well, my thoughts on it are really, I want to process your talk, Ara, to knit that together a bit more, because what I focused on was, in essence, Jonas as curator and how he was this catalyst. And then what you were describing really connects to that so importantly in terms of that kind of rhizomatic structure, in terms of that, I kept writing down so many notes, but between memory and consciousness, the idea of this idea of I'm sorry, I have so many notes from your talk in different places in relation to mine, but they're indivisible, in short. They're absolutely indivisible. And that, what I want to think about more, and so I don't really have an answer because my mind is processing so much, is also in everyone's talks, this sense of the contingent, this sense of, what you talk about contingency and necessity not being mutually exclusive. And how I never forget Jonas's video response to John Hanhart, a wonderful film curator, my predecessor at the Whitney, proposing to bring anthology filmmakers into a kind of alliance with the Guggenheim, and Jonas explaining why that would never happen. And so, the idea of curating outside the institution of anthology, despite being an institution of sorts, is outside institutionality in some very important way. And the role of curating within that, as some kind of itinerant, kind of ephemeral practice, which curating is, because once the show's down, that's it. How that relates to place and how his own filmmaking relates to place, because so many places, when you look at Lost, which covers so much, are all gone. So this sense of the ephemeral experience of the screening, the expanded cinema event in the Wurlitzer, a building that no longer exists, all of this, it's as though his writing, talking about the loss of and being so away from home, away from a society in Lithuania that was constantly in flux because of what was happening even before the war and after. They are so indivisibly linked. But which is the great joy of this, is that now I want to really think about that question, because it's so the relationship to his own filmmaking and poetry, and the generosity, which is a word that somebody used, is a million miles away from the sort of career curating and the institutionalization of everything, including curating, which collectors like Los Engravidos and Almudena are pushing against too. So I think what's interesting now and what the pandemic produced was a kind of, as everyone went onto the screen, a kind of democracy of curating and thinking and pedagogy, because everyone was on the same screen. And so I think that in relation to a deeply disturbing sort of takeover of the city, as it's resolutely sort of erased by these homogeneous glass buildings, means that what Jonas curated and made becomes this kind of model for the future in a way. Because for everything that's happening now, there's a strong reaction against it that Jonas, in his work and in his curating, becomes a very important touchstone for.
Thank you. I just there are like two things. I see that there is also a Q&A tab here, and Jean Lyotta wrote a very lovely message thanking everyone for brilliant talks. And we're almost running out of time. Unfortunately, probably many people are watching outside, and we really don't have access to their questions. But the question probably would be, the continuation would be a goal, and the discussion about Jonas, we all know that it will not end in terms of how important his legacy is. I was thinking about, since we had this question about the connection between his writing, his curatorial practice, and his filmmaking in the end, and actually us as creators, Vanessa, when we work, we talked a lot about that. And since we brought all the film culture issues to Lithuania, it's still at National Art Gallery out there, and we're like reading and thinking what to expose. We brought a lot of movie column excerpts, and what's clearly, especially in movie column, what's clearly visible, there is some kind of there are like two things at least that came to my mind now, thinking about all those connections. On the one hand, we talked a lot about that with Vanessa, but you notice that Jonas not was like super big fan follower of avant-garde or underground film practices in the very, very beginning. He was like super open to mainly non-Hollywood, but like European art, modern cinema. And when you read movie columns year by year, you see that at some point he becomes more and more enthusiastic advocate of specifically avant-garde New York scene and specific filmmakers, and somehow it also related to the curatorial practices. And we all know that he didn't start shooting films in the beginning. Basically, the first things he did, he watched films, and after watching, he realized this need for some kind of infrastructure that is not covered by Cinema 16 and some other things, and he started to create films everywhere, and then started to write, and then there is like some kind of this practice informing each other, and somehow like in regard to archive is interesting, because we also thought like there is like this idea of archiving or making things, preserve things, making films even canonized, which sounds like a bad word nowadays, but when the canon is not existent, that was a like sort of almost sincere sort of idea he worked for, canon of essential cinema, but in essential in terms of those films that are not really represented in many ways. They are not written about, were not shown widely, were not preserved. And he basically, this idea of anthology archives, it's like already archive is like one of the keywords. And then when you go to his films, he's also basically archiving in quotation marks, of course. So I don't know, I just had this in regard to that question, how this related, all these activities, but also in regard to what we talked about, the archive or some kind of archival impulse, but very personal, but also ethical or aesthetical. Maybe Inessa want to add something, because we have like plenty.
No, I just wanted to remark that behind you there are many boxes which are evidence of this impulse.
I had Amy Taubin came to visit my class this week, which was such a pleasure, and she's so insightful. And you know, something I didn't know is that when Jonas stopped doing, reverberating. Yeah, when he stopped doing the movie journal because the editor no longer, or the publisher no longer liked criticism in the first person. And tried, to edit Jonas's work, at which point he said, "I'm done." And he said to Amy Taubin, "You know something about film, why don't you do it?" And so she took over. And so she was talking about him as a critic. And she said that he didn't believe in conflict of interest. And I thought that was so interesting because, he really became an advocate for, the avant-garde filmmakers. And of course, there were the filmmakers who felt left out, like Jonas wasn't writing about them enough, or, as frequently as they would have liked. And, some filmmakers felt very bitter about that. But he believed in advocating for these films, which is not the traditional role of the journalist. And I think that's so interesting, to think about conflict of interest in writing. It's almost as if conflict of interest is something that belongs to the sphere of capital. And I know this from writing for Art Forum all the time. Galleries write to me and they say, "Would you like to review the show of this terrible artist? We'll fly you all expenses paid to Los Angeles and put you up for a week if you." And I'm like, wow, that's really paying to play. And yet that's not considered conflict of interest. And yet what's considered conflict of interest is if I write about the films that someone I know has been making for years. But in that situation, I've had the opportunity to have conversations about those films for years. And I have such insights into them because of learning about their practice. And so I think it's really interesting, this idea of conflict of interest being part of, it's very easy to see the art world as a nepotistic place full of conflict of interest, but there's two kinds of attachment or association that we're talking about that are really important to distinguish. And that sort of sponsorship by the gallery in LA, Jonas was not interested in that, but he didn't abide what would be considered conflict of interest now because he was writing about the filmmakers that he was living alongside of.
Thank you all. It was a wonderful, wonderful afternoon and evening in Vilnius, in Europe. Thank you all for joining us today. The symposium, which really is a big event for us, and hopefully, and I'm sure actually, that it will lead us to some new avenues, whether in our scholarship and curatorial work, or in the work of our students or just audience who listen today and will watch, I don't know, recordings or thank you all again for your wonderful presentations, for your time, and for your intellectual efforts and energies. I think it's in the spirit of Jonas very much. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for everything.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.